I'm Andrew Basiago, and this is the Quest for Truth.
And my name is Aaron Moriarity. I will be your moderator, and we're back for another episode of the Quest for Truth with Andrew Basiago. Couldn't be happier. Andy, how are you doing?
Excellent, Aaron. How are you?
If I was doing any better, I'd be you. It's always true. So, what do we have on the roster for today, Andy?
Well, on this episode of the Quest for Truth, we're going to examine about 20 pieces of evidence that establish my true experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus, the U.S. time-space program at the time of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community. Now, admittedly, 10 of those evidential proofs are going to be based on hearsay, and I'll explain what hearsay is.
Okay.
But just in prescript, let me say that just because something is hearsay doesn't mean it's not true. It basically means it's not reliable. It's not admitted into evidence in a U.S. Federal or state or local court. But that does not mean that such forms of evidence are not true. What it actually means is they are not what's known as direct evidence, which is what the law calls actual evidence. So I'll distinguish those points, and then I'll go into what hearsay is and what direct evidence is. And then I'll go into those 10 evidential proofs based on hearsay and 10 that are arguably either direct evidence or much closer to admissible evidence in a court of law. But first, applying the old Robert's Rules of Order, I want to address some unfinished business from last week's show.
Okay. What was the unfinished business?
Well, okay. On the episode of The Quest for Truth that we did on July 14th, within about, 2 or 3 minutes of starting the broadcast, I was asked for my opinion of the secret space program claimant, Tony Rodriguez, who has just published a book claiming to have worked in the secret space program on the moon, Mars, and the planetoid called Ceres. And after that, I offered my opinion. I wasn't interested in opining about someone's claims. I had stated on the Quest for Truth that I don't really welcome that role. I never took it upon myself to play that role. And then I was somewhat disturbed that as a result of just offering my opinion as asked and being courteous to that person who sent that request that I comment about the claims of Tony Rodriguez, it was claimed that I was attacking Tony, or also that I was being egotistical. So let me state that when somebody offers an opinion about the truthfulness of somebody alleging historical experience, just as when somebody testifies in a court of law, if you are addressing the truth or falsity of a claim, a person, a charge, you are not attacking that person. You are stating what you believe is the truth. And I think that we would be in jeopardy as a civilized nation if we began to confuse differences of opinion with attacks. I wasn't attacking Tony. And tonight I'll share with our listeners some evidence that I actually acquired having a friend go into the first couple chapters of Tony's book about why I put him not in the true thread, but in the false thread within the evolving literature of the secret space program. But let's be real about my role in that literature before I throw down the gauntlet tonight regarding who I believe and who I believe has been prevaricating. not telling the truth for different reasons, because they're opportunists trying to make money, or they're fantasists or deluded, or even government operatives of some or multiple world governments or agencies of this country or another country. I just don't know. Now let's go back to the beginning. I came forward regarding my experiences in the secret space program in 2009. When I did so, I described working under Howard Hughes, going to Mars via a revolutionary device known as an aeronautical repositioning chamber. Because that device had been amply described by two previous SSP claimants, Michael C. Ralph, beginning in 1909, and Arthur Neumann, beginning in around 2006, I gave credit to those two gentlemen because I said, boy, I was going to Mars via this device. How would they have known about this device if they were not also going there, and even earlier? It was Michael C. Ralph, of course, who inaugurated the claims of a 20-year and back process, basically spending 20 years in the SSP and then being age regressed 20 years and sent back in time 20 years. In his case, from 1996 to 1976, which completely fit the timeline that I had about working with Howard Hughes, because Hughes supposedly had died in 1976, and yet I knew him when I was going to Mars beginning on July 7th of 1981, and I met Hughes a number of times in El Segundo, California, in the early and mid 80s. Okay, so now when I came forward as the third claimant in the sort of the advent of the SSP as a subject within exopolitics, as it were, I then did something which remains unprecedented to this day, 13 years later. It's 2022, right? I brought forward 4 other individuals who I was both trained with and on the surface of the red planet with. Okay, so I've often emphasized, I'm sorry if people have heard this too many times, but it's my position that the true claimants regarding the SSP were in this order: Michael C. Ralph, Arthur Neumann, myself, Andrew Basiago, William B. Stillings, Bernard Mendez, also known as Bernie Mendez or Benny Mendez, William Whitecrow, whose original name was William Paris, Dr. Ralph Kennedy Johnston, Sr., and Laura M. Eisenhower. Now, the first 7 were gentlemen who went to Mars via ARC. Now, in the case of Laura Eisenhower, that's very interesting. What did she say when she came forward in around 2011? She revealed to me privately that her Aunt Mary Jean had gone up there with me to Mars at least once. It was on March 3rd of 1983, in fact. She stated that she was invited to go with her 2 boys, Gavin and Garrick Eisenhower, 2 young men, and I had the honor of meeting in 2011, and they were really cool kids. They were really healthy, bright, stable young men. And she also stated that she was told, Laura, that she would be going, and her sons would be going to Mars via ARC. I said, Laura, do you realize that that's what we were trained in, that was the name of the device that Hughes was using to send people into space? It was the Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, or ARC. So, Aaron, what did we have a couple of years after I came forward? We had 2 previous claimants, myself, 4 other colleagues of mine that I brought forward, and the great-granddaughter of President Eisenhower acknowledging her aunt's involvement, her invitation to go to Mars, and the name of the device we were going to be using to get there. Essentially a space elevator, or ARC, or jump room, that was basically an elevator-like contraption that would morph from a box-like structure into a cylinder, and then anywhere from about 10 to 20 minutes later, open up in the sub-basement of a U.S. facility on the Red Planet. Now imagine the deep state. From my definition, what the deep state is basically is an intelligence community that is involved in the abuse of power. That's really, I mean, people have called it, the permanent secret government, the deep state, there are other names for it.
Illuminati.
But basically, we're talking about an intelligence community that's engaged in what Richard Dolan has been saying for about the last 10 years, has been involved in the breakaway civilization. That's the implication of where the literature of the deep state meets the literature of the secret space program. And I'm not bragging. I'm simply bearing witness to history when I say that, in a sense, I was the keystone person to both link the claims of Ralph and Neumann and then share my own experiences, both time traveling and going to Mars, bringing forward 4 of my colleagues and the great-granddaughter of a president. So, for example, I was critical in getting Laura M. Eisenhower booked on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie, a show that also featured, in addition to myself, William B. Stillings. Brett Stillings talked about going to Mars, and Laura talked about being invited to go there. So let's go back to the origin of the SSP before we begin entertaining the apparent truth of Tony Rodriguez and the other people in this field, which has become quite crowded with claimants, that I simply do not believe. Now, I believe, again, people may dispute this. I'm not being egotistical any more than, look, somebody on a jury who says guilty is being either egotistical or is attacking the defendant. When a jury says, that's it, we're finding this person guilty, what are they doing? They're stating their opinion about true history, that somebody violated a criminal law and committed a wrong against the state or feased a civil tort of some kind and committed a harm against an artificial or legal person, a natural person or a corporation. That's what juries do. They're not attacking the defendant in a criminal or civil matter. They are offering their understanding of true history. So, in my understanding of true history, because I have evaluated all the claims of roughly the last 8 or 10 people in the emerging or evolving literature of the secret space program, for various reasons, I have discounted the truth value of, I'm sorry, and I'm throwing down the gauntlet tonight, Randy Kramer, Corey Good, Tony Rodriguez, Jason Rice, Penny Bradley, Emery Smith, Johann Fritz, whose real name is Will Nutter, Tomas Alvin, Solomon Berg, and Anthony Zender. Now, my belief that this was a second thread of the SSP, the Secret Space Program, that was based on falsification for different reasons. I mentioned basically opportunism, delusion, and government disinformation, is based on specific reasons that anybody is free to even call me on the phone, and I'll say, this is why I don't believe this person. So let's look at well, before I get to last week's show, the show on July 14th, in which I was basically attacked as either an egotist or an attacker for answering a question about Tony Rodriguez. Let's get an understanding about what I've done and what's happened. So, for example, I did Coast to Coast AM 10 times, what was then the world's leading radio show. And I got the author, Tim Cohen, booked on that show, just as I'd gotten William Stillings and or Eisenhower booked back in 2010. This was about in 2020. I got him mentioned to the show. I gave him the name of the producer. I gave Tim Cohen, the writer, the number for Lisa Lyon, the producer for George Norrie. I gave him George Norrie's email address. And when I had done George's show, Coast to Coast AM, the second time on 11/11/10 years earlier, George opened that show by saying, Andy, last time when I had you on, I said to myself, hey, I believe this guy. And I said to him, well, you're an astute judge of the truth, George, because I'm telling the truth. And then 10 years later, when Tim Cohen went on, this person I was helping, and said to George, when I first heard Andy, I thought, oh, this guy is crazy. George piped in, so did I, or I did too. So in other words, I have advanced the literature of the hidden history of time travel technology and the hidden history of the secret space program, and done so for years, and prevailed through hundreds of shows and a dozen or so network TV shows, and never been rebutted. And I've been attacked by the very people who reported on me. Look at what happened when I did conspiracy theory with Jesse Ventura. We went back to the house in White Rock, where my late father Raymond and I had lived first in 1973, after we got to the summer of 1973 from the fall of 1971 via teleportation-based time travel. And then we lived there in the summer of 72. And the woman living in that house said, wait a minute, Governor Ventura, I know who Dr. Harold Agnew was, and I know that he was the director of LANL, the Los Alamos National Labs. And you know what? I also heard of Project Pegasus. And so that was so startling, a confirmation of my truth, that Tyrell Ventura, the young son of Governor Ventura, literally turned around and walked off the set with astonishment that, oh, Andy cannot be prevaricating. This must be true. That means we developed time travel by 1970. And then at the end of that show, working from a script written for him by his producer, Michael Braverman, Governor Ventura, the former governor of a U.S. state who I admired as an independent, basically said, I don't believe Andy time traveled. I believe he was a victim of government mind control. That was just made up nonsense. So the point about this story about George Norrie and Governor Ventura is like President Kennedy. I have been wounded in the house of my friends. It just happened again after our episode of The Quest for Truth. I didn't wish to attack Tony. I was simply answering a question that somebody else posed about the claims of Tony Rodriguez. So to do so a little bit more deeply, I had a good friend go into the first chapter of Tony's book. I am legally blind. I cannot read. I mentioned on last week's The Quest for Truth that when I get a device to read adequately, or I get, for example, contact lenses that allow me to see again, which, praise be to God, are in the offing for all the blind, I will read Tony's book. I was in fact, in other words, as a lawyer, as a writer, as an environmental scholar, as a Cambridge-educated social scientist with 5 academic degrees, I was stating that I was going to hold my opinion, my conclusion about the truth or falsity of Tony Rodriguez in abeyance until I could evaluate the claims in his book. But I did find two very interesting points he made in his book that I think are what social scientists would call threats to validity. The first is he identified the gifted and talented program, which I was part of, which Dr. Michael Sala, an Australian National University conferred PhD in political science, found my name in the U.S. government formerly secret documents, secret records of the G&T program, the Gifted and Talented Students Program, which was launched by Admiral Hyman Rickover, President Jimmy Carter's mentor, in the late 1950s under Project Talent. As I stated on one of our last shows, Project Talent was a federal program that tried to identify young Americans, basically American children, of exceptional IQ, psychic ability, and leadership potential. Now, what I'm stating, Aaron, is that Michael Sala, Dr. Michael Sala, has confirmed finding my name in those records. Now, that program was always known as either the Gifted and Talented Students Program or the G&P program. But in his book, in a way that I think raises a threat to the validity of Tony's claims, he calls it TAG, the Talented and Gifted program. Now, where do we find the term of art, capital TAG, since it's never been used to identify the G&T program? TAG, I'm sure that the Nostradamus scholar John Hogue, Hogu, would confirm the statement. TAG, TAG, appears in the prophecies of the French psychic and scholar Michel de Nostradame, also known as Nostradamus. In other words, TAG appears elsewhere in the internet culture regarding Nostradamus, not regarding either the secret space program or the Gifted and Talented Student program. Now, the other claim that Tony Rodrigues makes in his book that I think is a legitimate threat to validity, I'm not saying Tony's lying. I'm not even saying he's prevaricating. I'm not even saying he's delusional or making up things. He may actually believe what he's saying. But another thing I find quite suspicious is that he states that when he was like 10 years old in 1982, that would mean that, of course, Tony entered government service when I was going to Mars, about 10 years or more after I was no longer time traveling. In other words, I stopped time traveling in 1972. That's the year that Tony says he was born. And then he says he entered government service at age 10 in 1982. And that would be right in the thicket there when I was really going to Mars extensively. And he says when he was being invited to basically get into an SAP, right, a special access program, he was asked whether he wanted to join the breakaway. Well, wait a minute. The phrase, the breakaway civilization, was only created about 10 years ago by the distinguished ufologist Richard Dolan to describe a culture where the permanent secret government, the deep state, would be so exploiting breakaway information from downed extraterrestrial craft and secret technical developments like the ones I was involved in Project Pegasus to literally create a breakaway civilization. There was no use of that term back 40 years ago in 1982. So in stating that he was asked whether he wanted to join the quote unquote, the breakaway, what was Tony Rodrigues engaged in? He was engaged in what we would call in the study of history, what's known as historiography. Something that I had to avoid when I was doing histories for UCLA, one of the most advanced history departments in America. I have a Bachelor of Arts in my first academic degree. It's known as a presentist violation. So let me give an example of what that would be. If somebody said to me, look, I know who killed President John F. Kennedy, and then you said to them, when did you learn this? And they said, November of 1961. You say, wait a minute. How could you? President Kennedy was shot in November of 1963. That's a presentist violation. You're applying later knowledge of President Kennedy's tragic assassination with an earlier time. That can't be. It had to come after he was suddenly killed on November 22nd of 1963. So I believe we found both a term of art from Nostradamus and a term of art that's only about 10 years old in Tony's claims about his now 40-year exposure to the SSP. What do I believe that means? I believe that those are threats to validity that in a court of law would cause Tony to be regarded as not telling the truth. Now, do I have a right to make such a conclusion? I think so. I spent 3 years studying law. I passed the bar in an advanced state, Washington. I then was admitted to the district court, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington. There are 600 or more law schools in this country. Anybody could just take a class in, for example, the law of evidence or criminal procedure or civil procedure and start to study these forms of legal reasoning. That's all I was doing with Tony and those 10 people I mentioned. I am discounting what they're saying because they have been found lying. That is not attacking somebody. That's just bearing witness to the truth, to true history. Let me give you another example. The claimant known as Johann Fritz was on my radar because one of the things I found about the false threat of secret space program claimants is they were alleging a German presence on Mars that I do not believe existed, at least by 1984. And many of them say they were sent, for example, Penny Bradley says she was sent to Mars via the Germans in 1963. Now, when I learned of this seventh or eighth claimant in the second thread, right, Johann Fritz, I said, that's interesting. That's a German name. I wonder if his name is really Johann Fritz. Maybe he's just trying to use an alias to connect himself to the false claim of the German presence on the red planet. And what did I find? Through an old friend who shall remain nameless, I found that Johann Fritz's real name is Will Nutter. So I said to Dr. Sala a few weeks ago when I did his show, which was on June 28th, and my second appearance with Dr. Sala will be on in 7 days, on July 28th, and every 28th thereafter, at least for the foreseeable future. I didn't say, Dr. Sala, what is your opinion of Johann Fritz? I didn't say, Dr. Sala, what do you think of Johann Fritz? I said, do you have anything that causes you not to believe Johann Fritz? And this scholar, with a PhD in political science from Australian National University and a work service that I've also verified as a professor of political science and somebody involved in conflict resolution at American University in Washington, D.C., said, Andy, I asked Johann Fritz, what degrees do you hold? And he said, 2 degrees to 2 PhDs. I said, well, that was interesting, Michael. By the way, this was off the record, but I don't think Michael Sala will be offended for me sharing this information. I said, well, that's interesting. Isn't the average onset between initiation of studies for PhD and the granting of a PhD on average now 7 years in the United States? I mean, Aaron, that's why I went to Cambridge, so I could get a PhD Cantab in a year or two after I got my MPhil there. And I almost did, but then I thought, well, no, I can just pass the bar and do more as a lawyer and a writer than as a teacher of undergraduates. I decided I didn't want to become a professor. So I didn't stay at Cambridge and get my PhD, but I was invited to. So I do know that the average time studying and earning a PhD is now 7 years. And I thought, wait a minute, Dr. Sala, if Johann Fritz is claiming 2 PhDs, he's talking about 14 years at the doctoral level. That's a tough schooling to bite off. That's a tough row to hoe.
No.
And so he said, well, Andy, what I did was I said, okay, Johann, first of all, he said, that's not his real name. So my other friend confirmed that his name is Will Nutter. Interestingly, he's a former U.S. Marine. That may be telling of what we've been dealing with. He said, so, Johann, what did you write your theses about for those 2 PhDs? And this individual, using an alias for no reason, then stated that he could not tell Dr. Sala what his theses were by which he earned those 2 PhDs. Now, what is that in the law? That is a rebuttal of a witness. When a witness claims that they have 2 degrees, or they're working as a lawyer or a doctor or a college professor or whatever, right? A doctor, a lawyer, an Indian chief. If they can't prove it by what those people do in those roles, the court determines, both the judge and the jury determine that they are lying. That's not me attacking Johann. That's me sharing with what a distinguished scholar in exopolitics found in the most pedestrian questioning of this individual, Will Nutter. I do not believe Will Nutter. His use of the name Johann Fritz and its apparent connection to what I call Germania, this false claim of a German presence on the red planet, does not work. I already have found threats to the validity of people like Randy Kramer, Corey Good, and the rest. So anyway, that's all I was doing last week. And I really think, it's unfair to me to have really served in both the advent of time travel and then the emergence of time-space exploration on the other planets, to then have a spade of untrue people come along and then be accused of attacking them. What if after Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon, the first Americans and the first human beings, at least who were revealed in this epoch of civilization, they then found that a former bartender from San Francisco was saying, oh no, it wasn't Armstrong and Aldrin, it was me, Randy Kramer. That's what I found with Randy Kramer. I spoke with his wife. I interviewed him. I repeatedly found him lying about even the name of his wife on Mars. You don't have a wife die in your arms on another planet and at age 45 forget what her name was, or not be able to name any comrade on the red planet. And by the way, that's a number of the things I've found in the false thread are they state where they were on the moon, even though we know that we were chased off the moon by ETs with Apollo 17 in 1972. They claim a German presence on Mars that we certainly weren't trained in. It wasn't there when I left the program in August of 1984. And as I stated, they've even made claims, such as Penny Bradley's, that they had German contact on Mars 21 years before I stopped going there. Well, wait a minute. If the Germans were on Mars in 1963, when Penny was sent there, wouldn't there be some evidence of that 21 years later when I left Project Mars? But there wasn't, okay? And none of those claims of a German presence were confirmed by Stillings, Mendez, Whitecrow, and Johnston, individuals I worked with. And I've described multiple things that happened both in our training and on the surface of the red planet. And we've done hundreds of interviews together in 15 countries, okay? Vinnie Eastwood of New Zealand and all of them. Now, another pattern in the false literature of the secret space program is they never mention the first 7 claimants. They scarcely mention Laura Eisenhower except to invite her to their conferences where she doesn't address what she knows about Mars. For some reason, I'd like to confront Laura about that. There was a time in 2013 when I called Laura Eisenhower and I said, Laura, is there anybody in the truth movement who you know is not telling the truth? And she said, yes, and hung up the phone. Maybe she was ill, maybe she had to go to the ladies' room, but I think it was more like an evasion of confronting falsity. That bothers me. But prior to that, she had shared a lot about what she knew about Mars, even going on coast with me in 2010 and talking about being invited to go there. So after those 8 people came forward, the Germania claims, the German claims were made about Mars. The activity going to the moon was claimed, even though we were chased off the moon in 1972. The fact that we were getting there via arc was submerged, and all manner of claims have been made. The last one, or the second to last one, like the 9th claimant in this thread, Solomon Berg, has claimed that he was getting to Mars by nuclear explosions, propelling his space plane from behind. I rather think that would be a neat way to be burned alive in space, not get to Mars. I'm doing is bearing witness to these false claims so that a movement that I didn't start, but that I kickstarted significantly, can succeed so that humanity can win its place among the confederation of inhabited planets or whatever's out there. I'm not wishing to assert my accomplishments because on my website I'm going to be publishing my biography. I'm proud of what I've done, but I also recognize, look, as Desiderata, was that Max Eastman said in that great poem Desiderata, there shall always be greater and lesser persons than ourselves. That's true. Whatever you would want to be in life, the smartest, the richest, the most handsome, the most talented, the most athletic, the most famous, the most beloved, whatever.
Quit talking about me. Quit talking about me. Just kidding. Go ahead.
We're talking about what?
I said, quit talking about me. You said all those complimentary things. I just threw
I'm
a little
sorry, Aaron.
Threw a little joke in there. Sorry about that.
Right. Very good. Good one. Okay. Whatever inherent or social beneficence or goodness you would want claimed for yourself or by yourself, there shall always be a greater or lesser person than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be the brightest, there's going to be an Einstein. If you're a guy and you want to be the handsomest, there's always going to be a handsome guy like, I don't know, Robert Redford. Mm-hmm. If you want to be the richest, there's always going to be a Bill Gates or a Donald Trump or whoever, a Jeff Bezos, a Mark Zuckerberg, an Elon Musk. In other words, in life, as President Kennedy said, life is not fair. Whatever characteristic you would want, there will always be somebody greater and lesser in that area. I have always aspired to be a great writer. I've now written 6 very strong books that I think will stand the test of time. But I will never be John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway or Herman Melville, So that's life. So I'm not trying to come off as the last word in the SSP. I'm just trying to protect a movement that like I said, didn't start, but I kickstarted it into something greater. And it was really going somewhere. And I think that what happened was it really disturbed the deep state. By the way, the other term I was searching for was shadow government.
Oh, okay, shadow.
What Weber called the permanent secret government. I think that's a good term. We're talking about the intel community and the cryptocracy of wealth, privilege, and power that has been abusing secrecy to engage in metaphysical oppression in the same way that in previous generations, the slavery imposed on others was used to commit physical oppression against fellow human beings. That's the movement that I was serving and have been serving for over 20 years. It's been essentially the fulfillment of my career. I have lost all kinds of legal work, wealth, and I've suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as William Shakespeare called it, to advance the truth. And that's all I was doing on last week's show.
Right. Well, Andy, I speak for myself and maybe for some other people, but I would much rather hear you talk about your experiences than talk about other people's experiences. But I do understand your train of thought. And also, people might not realize that you are a trained lawyer. You've been trained to notice patterns of deception. And so you might have a key insight that other people might not have in relationship to other people's stories. But still, I would rather hear Andy's story than anybody's opinion on somebody else's story, because I think your story is so amazing. And you mentioned the secret space program with the age regression, and you revealed in one of our recent shows that you were age progressed in the program.
Right. When the first person I heard claim age, basically what regression and time travel back those number of years, the so-called 20 years and back, was Michael C. Ralph in 1999. And I was asked, that was, 23 years ago. I was 37. I'm now 60. And somebody said, well, Andy, what do you think of this? I think it might have been Eve Lorgan who asked me that question. And I said, Eve, I cannot discount Michael's claims because when I was in Pegasus, when I was going to go to 2045, they age progressed me from around age 10 to around age 45 or 50.
Wow.
Now, if they could age progress somebody in 1972, couldn't they age regress somebody after 20 years on Mars and then time travel them back 20 years and give them an honorable discharge from the U.S. Army? That's what Michael was claiming. And that was working with his wife, the late Stephanie Ralph, in an innovative form of psychotherapy in which his memories were unblocked. So what I said was, in regard to Michael C. Ralph, is, boy, I can't discount that 24 years after being able to age progress somebody, they were able to age or regress somebody. And, around 5 to 7 years ago, I'm not really sure when it was. It could have even been as many as 10 years ago. A woman attached to Project Pegasus, who chatted me up about 35 years later in Southwest Washington, Virginia Olds. I mean, I knew Ginny Olds when she was a young woman on Project Pegasus going back to 1971, 72. And she showed up literally coming to my apartment in a recessed area of Vancouver, Washington, that I don't know how she even found, and knocked on my door. That was around 2006 or so, like 35 years after I'd last seen her. She had gone from roughly age 40 to age 75. But anyway, she chatted me up and would take me to lunch, and we would talk about what we did together in Project Pegasus. Because I had been working on my memory since 1989, when my late father asked me to tell the story of Project Pegasus, because he felt we had been involved in something estimable, something important, something great. And Virginia Olds told me around 10 years later, in 2015, she said, Andy, I'm going to be getting my 16-year-old body.
Whoa.
Now, I don't know what was going on. I hope she wasn't saying that she was going to be given access to adrenochrome to essentially anti-age by taking that substance from tortured children.
No.
Aaron, I had a discussion today of about 4 hours before doing this show with a former high wizard in Satanism who left Satanism in 1999.
Wow.
Coincidentally, the very year that Michael C. Ralph came forward about his Mars experiences. And this gentleman told me that maybe what Jenny Olds was acknowledging was that she was going to get adrenochrome and feel like she was 16 again. But she told me she was literally going to be anti-age and be 16 again. And I was walking along the waterfront in Vancouver, Washington. I looked over to my right, and what did I see? A couple weeks later, a 16-year-old Virginia Olds. It was one of the most startling things I had ever seen. Because look, when I was time traveling, I might see a deceased person still alive like George Washington, but I didn't see somebody I knew go from age 76 or 86 back to age 16.
So you saw her after she changed?
That I saw.
You saw her after she changed?
No, I didn't see her change. I saw her as a 16-year-old, like she said she was going to become.
Did you
So
recognize
I don't think
you?
it was adrenochrome. I think it was some kind of secret government process to literally put somebody back age-wise.
Yeah.
In other words, look.
Wow.
Because we know they were age-progressing people 50 years ago when I was on Pegasus, and were age-regressing people 30 years ago in the late 90s, almost 30 years ago. Why would it be such a stretch? They found the way to take a living elder and put them back 60 or 80 years. And there are other people whose names I do not want to mention tonight that I suspect they've used this process for, because I have documented the fact, well, there's some clues, like they were buried in closed caskets. They were acting with their friends and loved ones like they were going away on a trip. Because imagine what you'd have to do if you anti-age somebody from, let's say, age 76 to 16 or 86 to 46, 40 years. Because I'm sure that these are all 20-year cycles, because the natural rhythm of the Earth is 20 years, just as reflected in tree rings, tree ring samples. So, for example, when I was sent back from 1971 with that handheld chronovisor that my dad and Connie Chavez had, it was, guess what? It's 1931, 40 years earlier. So I noticed, when we were first sent back to old Morristown, it was from 1970 to 1890, 80 years. So I do believe these jumps in time, these age de-agings, these age regressions are 20-year increments. So Ginny Olds was probably 80s. No, she was probably 76 and sent back to 60 years to age 16. But questions I would have would be, well, if your knowledge and wisdom and information are a result of the wrinkling of the human brain, what's called crenulation. And by the way, Albert Einstein's was really crenulated. He was quite a thinker, as we know. He proved it. I would wonder if they put you back, let's say, from my age 60, let's say 40 years to age 20. And I could benefit from all of the health advantages of doing so. Would I lose my knowledge and wisdom? I mean, I earned 5 degrees after age 20. I became wiser as I approached age 60. Would I want to just uncrenulate those crenules and lose my wisdom, lose my knowledge, lose my experiences, my memories? That would be my question to who's ever doing this age regression. But that was, now, in the law of evidence, what was that when I witnessed a 16-year-old Virginia Olds? Was that hearsay or direct evidence? What would be your guess?
Well, if you didn't check her ID, I'd say it was hearsay.
No.
No?
That was direct evidence.
Direct evidence, okay.
Now, what is hearsay? Hearsay is an out-of-court statement, verbal or written, and there's a weird phrase that's somewhat inscrutable. It takes law students a week or so to figure out what it means. Offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. So when somebody says to a prosecutor, let's say in a criminal trial, somebody for bank robbery, Mrs. Adams, were you in the bank when it was robbed? Yes. And who robbed it? And she points to the defendant's table and says, that man right there, Mr. Baker, that is the man I saw robbing the bank. That is not hearsay. That is what the law calls direct evidence. Also, actual evidence. Also, direct, admissible evidence. As direct evidence. Now, hearsay would be when Mr. Carr would say, I was outside the bank and Mrs. Adams came out of the bank and said, Mr. Carr, I just saw Mr. Baker rob the bank. Because what is that?
Hearsay.
That's an out-of-court statement. What Adams said to Carr, verbal, not written, but verbal, offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. So in other words, an American court at the federal, state, local level, I've practiced in all three, would be, not the Supreme Court, but the federal, state, and local courts of the state of Washington. The court would require the witness to the bank robber to come in and say, are you Mrs. Adams? Yes. Did you see Baker rob the bank? Yes, I witnessed that. But they couldn't admit Carr to say that he heard Mrs. Adams say, I saw Mr. Baker rob the bank. Because it wouldn't be reliable. It would be what the law calls inherently unreliable. In other words, we're such an advanced civilization that we say if somebody's going to be found guilty of a crime by a jury of their peers, or, for example, liable of some civil damages in a civil trial, We require that direct evidence come in to prove the truth of the matter asserted, that somebody robbed a bank, or that somebody was negligent in a civil context.
Wow.
Now, why do I have 10 pieces tonight that are hearsay evidence? What are those hearsay proofs? And why would I even bring them up if they're hearsay? I'm doing this for a reason. That is, just because something is hearsay, all that means is it's not admissible in a court of law. That doesn't mean that it's not true. It means it's inherently unreliable because it's an out-of-court statement, verbal or written, offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. Now, I began to study my experiences in Project Pegasus around 1990, but I was still in law school. I had to graduate from law school. Then I went on 2 master's degrees at Cal Poly Sloan and at Cambridge. And then I passed the Washington Bar in 1995. So already 6 years had passed since my late father said, took me to his knee and said, "Son, you must tell the story of Project Pegasus." Then, from 1995, when I then passed the Washington Bar in 1996 to around the year 2000, Aaron, I spent a good 4 years just writing down the names of the people I remembered on the program. I began writing down what happened in the program. Like I write down the word chronovisor, or teleporter, or plasma confinement chamber, or the names Harold M. Agnew, Sterling Colgate, Edward Teller, Courtney Hunt, William Paris, and so forth. So in other words, I spent, let's say, about 6 years after my father's death to about 4 or 5 years later, just writing down my memories of Pegasus. Then around 2000, 10 years after my dad's passing, I began honoring a request he made of me 11 years earlier. So I was kind of behind the 8 ball because, look, my dad was sort of in the center of mid-career professionals on the program. So when he was about 45, there were a lot of 45 and 65-year-olds and some 40 and 35-year-olds on the program. Like, for example, Jack Pruitt was born in 1934, so he was, as I talked about on last week's show, he was 35 in 1969 when I entered Pegasus. So that meant that 10 years after my dad's passing, most of the people had served on Project Pegasus were deceased. Now, in order to convert their memories of my, their confirmations, their corroborations, which means to prove the validity of my understandings of what happened, I was going to have to get signed and notarized affidavits. Only that would be enough to lay a foundation to get their hearsay statements admitted into a court of law. But that doesn't mean they weren't telling the truth. That doesn't mean I'm not telling the truth by sharing these hearsay proofs. So, who were those people? And what are these hearsay proofs? Well, the first was my late father, Raymond Francis Basiago. We were talking about, as I stated last week, we were talking about Pegasus extensively from around 1985, 86 to his death in 1990. There was no attempt by me or agreement by my dad to write an affidavit saying my son's memories are true. We served in DARPA's Project Pegasus to get together, because he was in one of those need-to-know positions in which I later learned he would have been assassinated if he had talked. And that was really true of all of his peers in the program that I would confront over the next, from 2000 to roughly 2004, 2005, when I came forward publicly. Actually, I first came forward with a public lecture about this matter on October 30th of 1994 in Portland, Oregon. Another person I spoke to but got hearsay evidence from was Dr. Harold M. Agnew. I called Dr. Agnew at his home in Solana Beach, California in 2000, when I was still living in Chatsworth, California, taking care of my aged mother, who was really on her last leg. She would die in 2003 from cancer.
Sorry.
And he said, Andy, I remember your father, and you're mixed up about the fact the teleportation program wasn't at the Los Alamos National Labs, it was at Sandia. So he said it was at one of the other major atomic research labs in New Mexico, so keep looking. Well, he was admitting that there was a teleportation program. Then I found a professional engineer admitted in New Jersey and California named Captain Lewis B. Wary, W-A-R-Y. Quite a name, huh? And Captain Wary helped me by saying, sir, when I was working on a naval submarine project at Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company, Woodridge, New Jersey, in the early 1970s, the very time you said you were teleporting to Mexico from that building, Building 68 of Curtiss Wright, as somebody directing 1,500 people working on the cooling system of one of our major nuclear submarines. I went past a room and saw this device that was exactly like what you're describing, these two elliptical shaped booms. And I said to one of my colleagues, what's that? And nobody would tell me. And then next time I walked past that room, it was gone.
Wow.
So that was a professional engineer admitted in New Jersey and California, a captain in the, I believe he told me either the Coast Guard or the Merchant Marine. It's been many years. Then I talked to Courtney M. Hunt. I had remembered working with Courtney in Project Pegasus, and then in Project Mars, where he was my second Mars training officer. And he said, Andy, when we found the note that you left in the Baton building saying, I, Andrew Basiago, teleported here from Curtiss Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey on April 9th, 1971, we checked out your handwriting, your fingerprints, and the existence of a teleportation program. And it was essentially investigated as a mystery within the intelligence community itself. But of course, Aaron, that's because it was so highly compartmentalized. But then Courtney was brought into Project Pegasus and knew why I had written what I had written. So he confirmed a note that I left upon teleporting. Wow. So, in other words, my dad admitted the existence of Pegasus. Dr. Agnew admitted the existence of a teleportation program. Dr. Wary testified to seeing the device, or at least one of the devices of that kind. And then Hunt, who had worked with CIA for like 35 years, from the Korean War forward, admitted knowing that the note that I had left in the Baton Memorial Building was found and sent on to the CIA.
Wow. I
had left it there intentionally to prove that I had been teleported.
That's awesome.
Just like I left that little toy hippo in that puddle outside the old school site in Laney, New Mexico, which is now in my possession, thank God. Then I spoke with Jack Pruitt in June of 2003, and he acknowledged that the program existed. And that's when he warned me that all of the children who had grown up after teleporting in the program and time traveling were developing a disease that mimicked diabetes. And Jack warned me not to go on metformin, which is also known as glucophage. What happened as a result of not listening to Jack Pruitt, one of my team leaders in Project Pegasus? Aaron, I lost the functioning of my kidneys. All of these kidney patients swelling all of these dialysis clinics in this growth industry called dialysis all over this great land are victims of metformin. The product's liability for a metformin lawsuit could bankrupt the allopathic medical community, just like a recent harm they did, which I will not discuss on tonight's show.
Thank you.
So anyway, if there's any trial lawyers out there, if you wish to contact me, please source me through the Washington State Bar Association.org website, WSBA.org. Find me and contact me. I'd be happy to be your named plaintiff on the products liability suit against the drug makers of metformin. It's put hundreds of thousands of Americans, perhaps even millions, in dialysis.
Wow.
And I can tell you that the being in kidney failure is not my cup of tea.
No.
And in fact, this gentleman who has left the Church of Satan and become a witness to our Lord Jesus Christ, just as I have, which got me kicked off of Coast to Coast AM, interesting, is also in stage 4 kidney failure and is legally blind like I am.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow. You know what, Andy? Everyone in the chat has said hi to you, and we're all praying for you, for your kidney and for your eyes. You know, it's a real loving community out here, and our chat is full of very wonderful people. And so,
well, thank you. God bless you too. That's wonderful. I pray for everybody as well as this, my beloved. We pray for everybody.
That's awesome.
And we pray to our Creator God, asking the intervention of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, because He said, "No one comes to the Lord, comes to God, but through me. No one comes to my Father, but through me." So that's the way to pray if you want to improve the world and improve your life. And in any case, this former high wizard in Satanism turned his back on the Luciferian cult that he was part of, and has done major radio. I don't want to give his name. I didn't get his permission yet. And isn't it interesting that he has the same medical issues that I have? And I've never been a minister. I really essentially just told the truth of my experiences. But because I've honored the truth principle, I felt it was less than truthful unless I stated that I didn't just see the scenes of Jesus of Nazareth's ministry and crucifixion, which was horrendous, difficult to watch. And I didn't just hear my late father confirm that he also had captured chronovisor holographic images of Jesus's resurrection, but that's who I believe in. That's who I am. And I think that's America. That was in fact the belief of all of our founders, except the deist Benjamin Franklin. That was established in my mentor Norman Cousins' book, In God We Trust, which I would recommend to everybody. It really kind of describes not so much that we should have a diminished Christian nation, Christianity being the only religion. We are a polytheistic, tolerant Christian nation that honors the right of others to seek their path to their Creator, or none at all, or just remain in doubt as agnostics, or whatever. But that was, in fact, the faith of our founders. I think that's an incredible thing. So anyway, that's all I was doing. I wasn't proselytizing. I was just speaking the truth, just as I've been upfront about my medical issue. So anyway, who else did I have a hearsay proof from on Pegasus?
Yeah.
What about John Beeble? When I went to New Mexico in 2003, after speaking to Dr. Agnew and Captain Wary and Courtney M. Hunt and others in 2000 forward, I then went to New Mexico, and I went up to a restaurant that had been known as Chicken Country Restaurant in White Rock, New Mexico, back in the early 70s. That was where my father and Dr. Agnew and other project principals used to meet and have these wonderful chicken lunches in these plastic serving crates. I'm sure that citizens of New Mexico would remember that restaurant. It's now a Mexican restaurant, or at least it was in 2003. So, Aaron, I go to the side of that restaurant, I knock on the door, and the chef comes out, and he walks me down into, through a hallway into the kitchen. He's making like 20 salads. He's got like 20 metal bowls out, and he's making the salads all at the same time. Here's the lettuce, here's the chopped green peppers and everything, carrots, tomatoes. And I say to him, "Sir, I beg your indulgence, but I'm a lawyer from Washington." And I just started to say, and I was on a classified defense-related research and development activity here in the early 1970s. Before I could even get those words, classified defense-related R&D program in the early 70s. He didn't even look up, and he said, "Oh, don't tell me. You're another one of the quantum leapers."
Oh.
same age Pierce, he was around my age, was the son of a Los Alamos National Lab employee, his father, who had told him that kids from around the country were teleporting into New Mexico and then teleporting out of New Mexico back home via, guess where? A teleport at the Sandia National Labs northeast of Albuquerque, the very labs that I took Governor Ventura to. Then, when I was there in 2003, I got another important confirmation, a hearsay proof, if you will, hearsay evidence that was nonetheless true of my time travel experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus. I met with Governor Bill Richardson. I'm not even sure he was governor yet. In June of 2003 at the Old Car Show up in Chama, New Mexico. That took place, my records reveal, around June 10th of 1963. And Governor Richardson was dressed in one of those pork pie hats with one of those white and blue seersucker suits and a vest. And he gestured to his assistant, "Oh, I see, Andy, you can take off." And then Governor Richardson came over to me and pulled me down an incline beyond the old cars there at the Old Car Show in Chama. And I hadn't seen him since he was doing the head count when we teleported to Santa Fe in 1972. He would take us into the Attorney General's office there in Santa Fe in the old the Baton Memorial Building and ask us our name and ask us to spell it, give our date of birth, just to confirm that we had teleported successfully to New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so I knew Bill Richardson on the project. He was like a 25-year-old Dewey. He was the Dewey who one of his colleagues said to him, "God, I can't believe these kids are teleporting here. It must not be. It must have some impact on them." And I remember young 25-year-old or 24-year-old Bill Richardson saying, "Whatever it is, it can't be good." And I also remember Bill Richardson's name being spoken of by my dad's longtime friend from Albuquerque, Connie Chavez, saying young Bill on the program becomes governor of this state, just like I had heard my dad say to Donald H. Rumsfeld, the defense attaché on Project Pegasus, one time when we went in a bar. "You know, Rummy, we've determined in the program that you make defense secretary." And Mr. Rumsfeld said, "Well, Ray, that's one prediction about the future that I'll only believe when it happens." Now, what Governor Richardson said to me when he kind of pulled me down the incline was, "Andy, I know who you are. I can confirm that you were in Project Pegasus. It did exist. I was in it. You were in it. But Andy, you have to understand something. You know that we've been visited by extraterrestrials because you were in something called Project Pegasus and you met them as a result." He was apparently talking about the two tall grays I met beneath Albuquerque near the Manzano weapons storage area. And he said, "And I know that we're being visited by extraterrestrials because I'm the congressman from the 3rd District or the governor of New Mexico," whatever he was then. And I'm a public official here in the state where the Roswell incident happened in 1947. But Andy, if I come forward and, let's say, do a press conference with you in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, that's it for my career in politics. I'm never going to go on in state of New Mexico or at the national level in any capacity because they'll say, "Looks like Bill Richardson has lost it. He's now saying he was on a time travel project." And everybody who's engaged in these snarky attacks on me would have attacked Bill. Now, Bill was, I think, a great American for reaching out to me, just as Jack Pruitt did, to protect my health and my sanity and true history, but also say, "Look, in my life scheme, I can't come forward because I would lose my career in politics." That's what he said to me. But yes, that meeting with Governor Richardson did happen, and he was quite an honorable gentleman at that. So I salute Bill Richardson of New Mexico. Now, after that meeting with Governor Richardson, either shortly before or after he became governor, I don't remember which. I do remember a lady came up to him before he met with me, per se, and said that she had always followed his career and voted for him. So I don't really know what position he then held. I think he had just been elected governor, or would soon be elected governor of that state. By the way, the 3rd district, which Bill Richardson represented, was the district in New Mexico where all the secret labs are. So is it that much of a stretch that I identified him being a 25-year-old on DARPA's Project Pegasus, which involved the creation and testing of time travel devices? No, I think when you're going to put a particular person born in Pasadena, California, the son of an American diplomat and a Mexican-born mother named William Richardson in the 3rd district of Albuquerque, it's quite credible that he would be from one of the classified defense projects from that very district. So anyway, after I met with Bill, who was quite a nice fellow, quite an honorable gentleman, I then met with a representative of the executive office of the U.S. President at the Wolf Creek Pass Ski Lodge in southwest Colorado in June of 2003. It was a sunny day, and there was little or no snow on the ground, so there were no skiers there. And when he screamed into the parking lot with his Audi, I thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to be Vince Foster. This guy's going to shoot me.
Oh.
And just put the gun in my hand like I, quote unquote, suicide me, right?
Wow.
But he didn't. He got out of the Audi, said, "You don't have to shake my hand, Andy. I know everything about you." And just like all intel people I've ever met with, not being one, just meeting with them, not being an officer in any of the alphabet agencies.
Right.
He said, they always say, I've got to be quick, Andy. I can't be here too long. Maybe that's because they stay ahead of Chronovision when they're breaking their secrecy oath. I got to really break the oath and skedaddle so they're not killed or captured. Mm-hmm. He said, look, Project Pegasus existed. You and your late father were in it. In fact, distinguished participants in it. Your names are all over the records. And it involved classified defense-related research and development activities involving triple T, time travel technology. But Andy, if you keep investigating, talking about, and writing about these time travel technologies, which remain sensitive, compartmentalized national security secrets as technologies, we, the executive office of President George W. Bush, cannot guarantee your survival. So, Aaron, in other words, what they were doing was either warning me or threatening me. I don't know which. I've never learned which.
Both.
I do know that
I think it's
the defense attaché in Project Pegasus, Donald Rumsfeld, was then in his second period of service as Secretary of Defense. First under President Gerald R. Ford in the 1970s, and then under President George W. Bush from 2001 forward. So I was either threatened or warned. I don't know which, but that was another hearsay claim, because I wasn't going to get an affidavit from that gentleman like, oh, I'm an executive, I'm a representative of the executive office of President George W. Bush. And yes, Andrew D. Basiago did serve at DARPA's Project Pegasus. I mean, come on, that's a non-starter. So all I can do, and all I was able to do during those years after my dad asked me to tell the story of Project Pegasus, after all that memory work that caused me to begin calling people in the year 2000, and then going to New Mexico and southwest Colorado in 2003, about a week after my mom finally passed away, and I could leave her side and caring for my beloved mother, who was a wonderful, saintly person, and who I loved very deeply and wanted to help. So my mom passed away, and I was then free to go to New Mexico and have those meetings. Those meetings had been scheduled for like 3 years. I started to set those up in 2000, 2001, even before 9/11, when I was remembering who served in the project with my father and I. So that was another hearsay claim. It was that guy saying, look, I can't give you something admissible I can't give you direct evidence reliable and therefore admissible in court. So-called direct evidence by like an affidavit saying, I, Joe Bloggs, representative of the Executive Office of the President, George W. Bush, does hereby attest and affirm that Andrew Basiago has served in DARPA's Project Pegasus, etc. But that's what happened. I would be lying not to share that hearsay. And for the last 20 years, Aaron, somebody like myself, trained in evidence by the great law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, one of our fine law school, Art LaFrance, trained me in what hearsay is. I've been accused of just sharing hearsay. No, I've been explaining hearsay and saying, look, I'm sharing hearsay, but it has nonetheless been true evidence. It's just not direct evidence admissible in court. And then what happened when I went in search of my childhood peers in the program? Well, 3 of them, David, Sharon, and Marianne, I shall not give their last names, remembered sitting in the Montauk chair, a time travel device. 2 of them, Mark and Kevin, confirmed teleporting. One of those gentlemen, Mark, remembered teleporting with me. And Mark also remembered that Kevin was the boy who lost his feet. I didn't realize that's who Kevin was when I spoke to him around the year 2005, after continuing my legal career up in the Northwest following my mom's passing in 2003. Now, how do we take Mark's statement, I teleported to New Mexico with Andy? That would be direct evidence if Mark was testifying. It's not direct evidence when Andy says Mark said he teleported to New Mexico from New Jersey with Andy. Okay? So I'm just doing what's called evidential line drawing here. If I was able to bring Mark into a public hearing and have him swear an oath to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so help him God, I know that Mark would say what he said on Dave Schrader's show and radio show, and what he said on Truth Frequency Radio, Beyond the Veil, with Chris and Cherie Gio. All pioneers in the radio work of the truth movement, just like Art Bell, George Norrie, John B. Wells, Jimmy Church, Clyde Lewis, Dave Schrader, and Chris and Cherie Gio were advancing this discussion about time travel, for example, going back to the 80s and early 90s. So let's put the new claims in context. But anyway, 5 of my childhood peers acknowledge having contact with time travel devices. David, Sharon, Marianne, who were in my group in Project Pegasus. And then Mark, who was 4 years older. And then Kevin, who literally lived down the street from me, the boy who lost his feet. I have his full name, first, middle, and last, and his date of birth. But I'm not sharing those with the public until I reach Kevin again, as I did 17 years ago, and say, Kevin, do you have, in fact, prosthetic feet? And do you remember that you lost them teleporting to Santa Fe, New Mexico from Woodridge, New Jersey, and unfortunately arriving in a public fountain that had been left on? And because your feet arrived later, because of the specific gravity of the water that you arrived in, your feet were sheared off at the ankles and slid onto the ground, yelling, my feet, my feet. I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without any feet? Okay? I do have his 1961 birthday. He was about 5 or 6 months older than I, but I don't want to give him a specific date of birth when I have it. So that's going to be a possible proof of Pegasus of a direct nature if Mark and Kevin testify. Even if David, Sharon, and Marianne testify that, yes, I was sitting in the so-called chair that did what Preston Nichols and Peter Moon said in their book about Project Montauk, beginning in 1983. Now, who else do I have hearsay evidence from in the nature of Pegasus proof. When my friend from Washington State, Dixie Winnett Karras, and I, Dixie being a very intuitive individual, went on my second fact-finding trip in September 2004, my second major fact-finding trip to New Mexico to prove my memories of Project Pegasus and get witnesses. We met a waitress at the Mineshaft Tavern in Madrid, New Mexico, right past the Cerritos Cultural Center, where the 1971 chronovisor probes that were used to send me to Ford's Theater on April 15th of 1865. On this July 14th show, I misspoke and said April 15th of 1863. Lincoln was shot 2 years later at Ford's Theater. That chronovisor was on the Symphony Orchestra stage at the Cerritos Cultural Center, and the Stargate that we used to get to 2445 was set up in the summer of 1972 on the Olympic-sized basketball court at the Cerritos Cultural Center, a building later purchased by the Sarkeesian family and used as like a roller derby rink, and then by an individual named Jesus Moroles, and then his wife got the Cerritos Cultural Center in a divorce proceeding. I don't know who owns the Cerritos Cultural Center today, but that was where both Chronovision and Stargate activity was being secretly performed by Project Pegasus in the early 70s. And we met a woman who was calling herself by apparently an assumed Hindu name named Ra Ananda. And Ms. Ananda told us while she was waitressing there at the Mineshaft Tavern in Madrid, a restaurant I had first been to when I was on Project Pegasus in the early 70s. There was even a minstrel show there at nights. That when she entered, she had been born like in the early 70s, and when she entered kindergarten in Santa Fe in 1974, as a kindergartner, she heard stories of the kids suddenly popping into view where? In the New Mexico State Capitol grounds. So look, if I could find Ra Ananda, or whatever that woman's legal name was, not her assumed, apparently Hindu or other name, other religious name, she'd be able to say, when I entered kindergarten in Santa Fe, I heard stories. Now, what would that be, Aaron, in the law of evidence? What do you think that would be if I even called Ra Ananda?
If you called her and asked her, or called on her?
No, it would be the truth, because that's what she was told. That would be double hearsay. She would be called only to report what others saw.
Okay.
She wouldn't be testifying to what she saw.
Double hearsay.
And so what my statement, Ra Ananda said, that when I entered kindergarten in Santa Fe, I heard about kids suddenly popping into view in the New Mexico State Capitol grounds. When Andy says that about what Ra Ananda said, that's double hearsay.
Okay.
If she testified and said, that's what I was told as a kid, that's what Ra Ananda was told when I was in kindergarten in Santa Fe, that would be hearsay per se.
Okay.
So again, that would not get me over the hurdle of the fact that these are true claims. But yes, I've always acknowledged that they are hearsay. But yeah, if I stated her claims of what she heard, that would be double hearsay thrown out of any court in the United States.
Wow.
So what comes closer to the direct evidence that I've accumulated over these 33 years since my father asked me to tell the story of Project Pegasus? That was in about 2 months before his death. That was like October, November of 1989. It's now July of 2022. So roughly 33 years. What are some of the direct forms of evidence
What
that
are
I've collected along these years? And just as an object lesson, truth value in evidence, in claims, and their validity versus threats to their validity. Notice how, unlike myself, many of the people in this second thread of secret space program claimants claimed 20, 40, 60 years and back. Therefore, 20, 40, 60 years of life, and then presumably anti-aging and setting back in time. Thereby hiding their service, the nature of what Michael C. Wells described in 1999 for the first time. And yet, they do not come forward with a single claim. For example, the only person that Randy Kramer brought forward was a general whose last name he provided, but stated that the general was talking to him in his head. Or, Corey Good claimed that his briefing officer, his handler, met him in the Kuiper Belt. Well, wait a minute. When I met with generals or admirals or senior officers in CIA, DIA, NSA, and so forth when I was serving on Pegasus, when I was serving on Mars, they might call me, sometimes on track phones that we can't, they're encrypted phones that people can't listen to, sometimes just on open line. Sometimes I would call them just from public phone booths. Or I would meet with them. Last time I met with Courtney Hunt to discuss my experiences was like in 1993 at Abe's Deli in Northridge, California. Why? Because it was very noisy at lunch, and there was such high back seating at each seat in Abe's Deli. She couldn't hear even what the person across from me at the table was saying, much less somebody in another booth. Okay, so I'm only distinguishing the fact that not only do I not believe the claims that there was any German presence on Mars, not only do I believe the claim that there's been any landing on the moon since 1972 when we were chased off the moon by ET with Apollo 17, but I am very suspicious when individuals claim decades and decades of service in space but can't name a single comrade. I can name people in my kindergarten class. I won't do it here, but I can list like 20 from 1966, 67. It's now 2022. Why can't they name people they were in space with 10, 20, or 30 years ago? They can't. They don't. That's suspicious. Most of us can also name, let's say, 10 or 20 high school or college classmates or people we knew in the military or our first job or whatever. That's normal human memory. Why are all these new claimants in the evolving literature of the SSP never naming comrades? When I asked Randy Kramer live on stage in 2020, doing everything in my power to prove his claim, when his ex-wife told me, Andy, he's lying, forget it. And I went away from that meeting with Andrea, the ex-wife of Randy, and I said, she's an ex-wife. She might just be a woman scorned. I've got to give Randy the benefit of the doubt, or Andy's truth value doesn't mean anything. And I asked Randy Kramer live on stage, okay, Randy, Barack Obama, Regina Dugan, and William Cameron McCool, who died aboard Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st, 2003, were 2 and 3, they were 1, 2, and 3 of my numerous comrades when I was on the Red Planet. Who were some of your comrades on the Red Planet? And Randy Kramer just looked at me and couldn't answer my question. Somebody who 3 years earlier had told Dr. Sala that the name of his wife on Mars was Deirdre. And then in 2020, when I again interviewed Randy Kramer on Gary Legier's show, Martian Revelation, Gary, of course, bearing the nickname Mad Martian, a critic of Richard Hoagland and the cover-up of what's on Mars, I asked Randy again, okay, Randy, what was the name of that woman who died in your arms on Mars, your wife who sadly passed away on the Red Planet in your arms after being attacked by a predator? And he just sat back and said, Doris. Okay, now that's not me making something up. That's not me attacking Randy Kramer. a lawyer admitted at the federal and state level in the state of Washington, asking somebody claiming service in the secret space program for corroboration or consistency regarding their own claims. And Randy Kramer did not meet that test. I found threats to the validity of his claims. Okay, so what are more direct forms of evidence that I've offered? Well, in the case of Project Pegasus, my book will name about 25 people who served in it, and I'll put asterisks next to those who have confirmed the time travel devices, like Mark, Kevin, David, Sharon, and Marianne, 5 of my peers in the program. I will also distinguish the deceased adult who confirmed the technologies, like my father, Courtney Hunt, Dr. Harold M. Agnew, Captain Lewis B. Wary, and so forth. Now, what else supports my claim? What comes closer to direct evidence? Well, the first proof I'd like to offer into evidence, if I might, Judge Moriarity, is the fact that when I was at UCLA over 40 years ago, I entered UCLA in 1980, 42 years ago, I gave an interview to a man named W. Lewis Perdue. Lou Perdue was a Cornell University graduate, an Ivy League graduate, who had worked for the Washington Post and had actually advanced the Watergate investigation with one of his colleagues at the Washington Post by gluing together some paper that had been shredded by the Nixon administration to conceal its wrongdoing.
Wow.
Lou Perdue then went on to a distinguished career as a writer of literature in the nature of Robert Ludlum, a thriller novel. I did call Lou in around 2000, and we talked about the fact that he had interviewed me for the Post in the 1980s, and I had talked about my experiences in Project Pegasus. For example, going back to see the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln. A classmate of mine named Evangeline M. Thompson, somebody who after all these years I remain a friend and a colleague of. Eva Thompson worked, for example, on the first and the third books in the Fatima trilogy that I did for Patrick Weig at Anomalist Books, entitled Heavenly Lights, The Fatima Apparitions and the UFO Phenomenon, and Fatima Revisited, the Marian apparitions in ufology, psychology, and science. So after all these years, Eva Thompson is available to say, Andy talked about time traveling when we were undergraduates at UCLA over 40 years ago. At least no more recent than exactly 40 years ago in 1982. That was, I think, around the time that I granted that interview to Lou Perdue so he could publish it in the Washington Post. I haven't even looked for it in the Post, by the way. I've heard people tell me they read it in the Post 40 years ago. So it was probably around 82, because my years at the Daily Bruin, where Lou Perdue was the media advisor for the Associated Students of UCLA, were 1981, 2, and 3, and then I left the Daily Bruin to pursue my own writing, like for the LA Reader and so forth. And I had a job on campus where I had to make more money than the Bruin was willing to pay me if I wanted to get through school. So anyway, Eva Thompson, I know, would be available to say, yes, Andy told me, for example, about going to Gettysburg in 1863, 40 years ago. So what does that establish, Aaron? That establishes at a minimum that if those two people were to testify about what I said 40 years ago, that means they would prove not that my claims are true, but that my claims are not of recent fabrication. And what is that? That is, in a sense, a rare exception to the rule against hearsay. If you submit evidence for the limited purpose of proving that your claims are not of recent fabrication, which I would be doing by calling Lou Perdue or Eva Thompson, and stating that I talked about Pegasus 40 years ago this year, 1982, that would come in to prove that my claims are not of recent fabrication. Of course, it wouldn't come to prove that I time travel, but that my claims of time travel are not of recent fabrication. Now, another similar claim is I've spoken at length, great length, as confirmed by David, Sharon, and Marianne, who's in the program with me, that in 2002, the DARPA time travel scientist, David Lewis Anderson, went on Coast to Coast AM, was still hosted by, I believe, by Art Bell, and stated that in the early 1970s, the Montauk chair went national and involved thousands of American school children in visits to their own subjective futures. So what was that? That was a Project Pegasus insider, Dr. Anderson, confirming what I had stated. That's coming real close to direct evidence. I mean, if somebody says, I was on the ship of the Titanic, I was on the floor of the Titanic. What is that called? The deck.
The deck.
I was on the deck of the Titanic, and I saw that man over there grab a life preserver, and as a result, several children, women around him drowned, froze to death. Mm-hmm. That would come in as direct evidence of that man's liability for manslaughter, right? In other words, when David Lewis Anderson said that about the Montauk chair, he was providing direct evidence as a Project Pegasus insider that such experiments were conducted. And that evidence is now 20 years old. So that is getting real close to direct evidence.
Wow.
Now, the second form of time travel after remote viewing that I've discussed in the 8 modalities of time travel I was exposed to was the practice of spinning up on a tabletop-like device with a kind of a Twilight Zone-like spiral image above us taped to the ceiling, like a poster.
Really?
With a time tunnel kind of tunnel.
Wow.
And when they did so, spinning caused us to have an out-of-body experience and to have a form of time travel. I have 2 witnesses to that process. One is the Canadian physicist Wilbur Smith, who has stated in interviews that, look, if you spin somebody, adult, child, whoever, they can travel in time. And I shared the story of that young actress, Noah D'Amico, who long after I came forward with hundreds of radio interviews, talked about being a young newcomer to Los Angeles. She was like in her late teens and was in a car accident where her car was spun, and she went into the home of the woman whose house or apartment was right near the scene of the accident, and the woman let her call her boyfriend. And then when she went back to bring a gift to that woman for helping her, the manager of that building or that apartment said, young lady, I don't know how some woman in this apartment or building, this house, could have helped you. It hasn't been occupied for 30 years.
Wow.
So that's an American actress who has a SAG card, who is a brilliant actress, singer, comedian, who has testified to being spun accidentally in a car accident and going back to an earlier period of history. I'm not making that up. If we've got an actress in Hollywood and a distinguished Canadian physicist, Wilbur Smith, stating that spinning can cause time travel.
Wow.
Okay, what else did I do? I remembered that the person who sent me to Gettysburg via plasma confinement was named Dr. Sterling Auchincloss Colgate. Dr. Sterling A. Colgate. Stir, as we would call him. When I went to Los Alamos in 2008, my third fact-finding trip, I went to his house. Wow. His wife let me into their house in Los Alamos. I was sitting at his kitchen table. And Stir, who sent me to Gettysburg in 1972, he sent me to 1863 to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. He would not come home to his own kitchen to talk about a classified project. When somebody who was sort of stalking time travel claimants, I shall not use his name on this broadcast, called Sterling Colgate, like in 2012, 2013. Dr. Colgate called me when I was driving through the American Southwest, like Arizona or New Mexico, and said, Andy, another wackadoodle has contacted me about time travel. And what I didn't tell Dr. Colgate when I tried to reach him in 2008 and remained in touch with him until his death around 5 years later in 2013 was that I had gone into the research library at New Mexico Tech in 2004 in that second trip that I did with my friend Dixie Harris of Washington. And I found a newspaper clipping that said, that was stamped with the date that it was published, that said, this week, Dr. Sterling Colgate of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology will deliver a public lecture, a free public lecture, about his advances in the new technology known as plasma confinement.
Wow.
Now, Aaron, what do you think, exception to the rule against hearsay, that article would constitute?
I think it's been more than 20 years, so it's admissible.
Bingo.
There you go.
Yes, it's admissible under the ancient records exception for the rule against hearsay because it is an ancient document that is self-authenticating. In other words, it clearly is a newspaper article. It clearly is not only 20 years old, but now 50 years old. I have a photocopy of it produced by New Mexico Tech and the kind research librarians there like Joy Thompson and her assistant who were helping me. She died of a cancer she got by playing in uranium tailings in Los Alamos, of all places. Bless her memory. Joy Thompson. No relation to Eva Thompson, I know her. An interesting synchronicity, though. And I have that photocopy. So that would come into evidence as an exception to the rule against hearsay, the ancient documents exception. Now, that would mean, for example, that even if it wasn't a valid birth certificate, when the birth certificate of Barack Obama's supposed birth in Hawaii was admitted into evidence, even if it was a forged document, if it was authenticated as a self-authenticating birth certificate, it would come in. Now, if it was then tested as it was and found to be a forgery, it would then not come into evidence, would be rebutted. But as a generalized matter, when an old newspaper article or magazine or letter or diary entry or book that's been published in the Library of Congress, being copyrighted, and so forth, is authenticated as veritable, it then comes in, even though it's a written document offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. You see, so its ancientness and its reliability as an ancient document overcomes the reliability problem and comes in that famous exception. And there are many for the rule against hearsay. So that's what I have. I have an article from 1972 that talks about the very scientist at the very university in the very year that he used that very technology to send me to Gettysburg. That's like getting a letter by Chris Kraft of NASA proving the existence that there even was an Apollo 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay? Mm-hmm. Here's the letter, Chris Kraft's signature. It proves out, boom. It proves that there was a space program, just like an authenticated photograph of Abraham Lincoln proves that's who our 16th president was. The rail splitter, Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah.
So we have to learn these patterns, these proofs of evidence. And those classes are available online in books at every major bookstore in our country. Just get a manual guide or other academic legal guide, law school guide, to evidence. And people will learn these ways of proving things. Because after all, the truth movement wasn't about mere allegation. It wasn't about what the law called mere assertion. It was about proof. It was about nailing the true history at all, not science fiction fantasy, not the willing suspension of disbelief by a group of opportunistic, deluded, and potentially disinforming government operatives. Okay, so what else do I have? Well, the famous Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg shows me at Gettysburg. As I think I might have talked about on a previous episode of The Quest for Truth, that photograph was found to have a few pixels of Mr. Lincoln when he was standing on the dais after he was probably waving to the crowd and sitting down before addressing the crowd for 15 minutes, because the orator, Edward Everett, spent 3 hours, and then Lincoln got up and gave a 15-minute speech that made history. And the orator, Everett, wrote Mr. Lincoln saying, "I wish I could have achieved in 3.5 hours or 3 hours what you, Mr. President, achieved in 15 minutes. Now, the Josephine Cobb image operates on several levels. First of all, it shows me in the same photograph with Abraham Lincoln. It has been authenticated as showing Lincoln. I have shown how the CIA identified as that boy in the image was me. So it shows me in a contemporaneous photograph. Now, on a deeper level, William Stillings and John Gannon went into that photograph, and they found that my cheekbone and my eye socket are visible after I had testified that I was fading from view when the Civil War photographer Matthew Grady or his assistant George Bachrach was taking that photograph. So in other words, a photo analysis of that photo shows both that I'm in a contemporaneous photograph with Lincoln and that I'm fading from view when the photograph was taken. That, Aaron, was not a known Civil War era photographic anomaly or effect. Mm-hmm. A blurring of somebody moving during the exposure was, but not a penetration into the very viscera, the very body of the person's photograph. And that's what you see in a blow-up of my face. Now, it also operates to show that I'm not making up my claims, because how would I fake a Civil War photograph? How would people be able to take a blow-up of that kid and think, well, wait a minute, this corresponds exactly to the shape of Andy's head, his cheeks, his chin, his ears, his neck, his shoulders, his torso, his legs. Yeah. Why is he standing in a 1970s posture in 1863? Why is he better fed than all the adult men standing around him? Isn't that probative of Andy's assertion that he wasn't a poor American starving after the Battle of Gettysburg raged through and past the farmlands of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a crossroads town? And so that 4 months later, when Lincoln arrived there to give the Gettysburg Address, the citizens of Gettysburg were starving. That's the truth of American history. And I show in that photograph that I was quite well fed. Not overweight, but not as thin, not as spaven, as they used to say of the men in that photograph. Mm-hmm. There are so many proofs in that photograph. It's amazing. And what's really amazing are some of the incredible coincidences and lucky aspects of that photograph. First, let's address the lucky one. I mentioned last week how 95% of Civil War photographs like that were destroyed after the Civil War by being used as glass panes in greenhouses. They faded in the sun. The other thing that's amazing is in my hand, I was holding a letter to Lincoln's Navy Secretary, Gideon Welles, to have Secretary Welles offer me aid and assistance in the field as basically a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, time traveling there from 1972 if I needed it. And I didn't ever get help in the field from anybody until 2011 when I was on the island of Maui and I had a falling out with the family I was living with. And the great-great-granddaughter of who? Lincoln's Navy Secretary Gideon Wells, Janet Lesson, and her husband Sasha offered me aid and assistance in the field and literally opened up a room in their compound, their rainforest compound, north of Wailuku, Maui, Hawaii. So in other words, what are the chances that the very Navy Secretary of Lincoln that would have offered me if I got in trouble going back to Gettysburg in 1863 would then come online with that very family in 2011? What, 150 years later?
That's pretty amazing.
Another amazing, it's an amazing coincidence. The fact that Brett Stillings found the truth of my claims in the photo analysis of my face that he did with John Gannon, and he is the great-grandson of who? Josephine Cobb, the photo analyst at the Library of Congress, who in the early 1950s found the little pixels of Mr. Lincoln on the dais at the back of that photograph. Just an amazing sort of synchronicities that gave me chills when I realized that they had happened.
Yeah.
So I'm sharing them with everybody tonight.
And
another example of this.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I was just going to interject a little bit here. I do have the picture of you at Gettysburg on the screen. However, it's not a very good copy. And you said that you saw this in like a Look or one of those bigger magazines from maybe the early 70s.
Well, we found a National Geographic. What I said was in 1972, I was sitting on the front stoop with one of my sisters, shall remain nameless, and we were looking through a stack of old magazines that were owned by the Cunningham family. Bob and Evelyn Cunningham lived directly across the street. We lived in a White House. They lived in a fire engine red house,
okay,
like a darker red house.
Mm-hmm.
And the name of that red escapes me. And they gave us these magazines, and I found that picture. It may have been National Geographic. It may have been Life. It may have been Look. It may have been the Sunday New York Times Magazine, but it was published in the early 70s, just as it had been published in the early 50s. When I found it might have been something like 1972 or 71, and it was one of those specials in Life 20 years ago in Life. But what I found is from that time when I saw myself in that image to when that image was placed on the internet, there was intentional degradation of that photograph. We also learned from Stillings and Gannon, when they went searching for that photograph,
mm-hmm,
that it had been moved from the Library of Congress to the National Archives and classified in. It was the only classified photograph in National Archives.
Wow.
Imagine that. That included even atomic explosions at Bikini Atoll and at the Trinity site in New Mexico.
Wow.
In Alamogordo, New Mexico. So here we have a government that's been allowing secrets of its nuclear explosions to be released, but not of some stupid photograph from Gettysburg that shows these few little pixels of Mr. Lincoln's face. Why would that be? Because this stuff is nothing made up. It's what the historical investigation of my truth has proven. So again, that's why I said last week, please cut me some slack. I've proven my case. And I'll do it again tonight if I might. Wynne Keach, the British researcher, contacts me a few years ago and says, Andy, remember when you talked about how your dad told you that his colleagues had found a way to put an electromagnetic signal through an 8-sided bismuth crystal and out popped the hologram that the chronovisor was based on, the so-called looking glass device? Well, I hope you're sitting down because, Andy, I just found a 1967 patent that was granted the famous Japanese-American atomic physicist Leo Asaki, also known as Leo Esaki, E-S-A-K-I, or A-S-A-K-I. And Asaki's patent from 1967 mentions a very conspicuous former inventor in the first listing of the prior works section of that patent. And I said, who was it, Win? Was it somebody on Pegasus that I've named? And he said, yes, Andy, do you want me to tell you? And I said, sure. And he said, your father, Raymond Basiago.
Awesome.
It mentions not only your father, which is one proof, but the fact that what it was citing from your dad was work on bismuth crystals, and the Saki's patent, as granted, was into 8-sided bismuth crystals. Aaron, that was 3 proofs that move beyond hearsay and get into the area of direct evidence that I could not have faked. How could I have faked a patent as granted into the U.S. and French U.S. patent archives from 1967 when I was, most of that year, I was 5 years old. I turned 6 in September of 1967, from which we can date my dad and I meeting with Dr. Agnew when I was 6. September of 1967 to September of 68. That patent had to be for my 5th or 6th year. Could any 5 or 6 year old somehow sneak a patent listening to their dad under some, for example, assumed name named Leo Asaki and get the patent? That is impossible. I would have had to invent something involving 8-sided bismuth crystals when I was 5 or 6 years old. And Aaron, I was a bright kid. I was a G&P kid, not the T and the G claimants of Tony. But I was not a child inventor. I was not Tesla at 5 or 6. So that is, I think, something that comes in under the ancient records exception for the rule against hearsay. What does it prove? It proves that Andy's father, as Andy stated, invented something involving 8-sided bismuth crystal, and it continued to be cited years later. That's a strong proof. We have Win Keach of Britain to thank for that. Thank you very much, Mr. Keach. Another researcher, again made possible through the internet, which if used properly has been a boon to historical research, but if used improperly has become a vehicle for pornography, defamation of character, copyright violation by groups like Scrib, and so forth, was provided by what Win Keach shared with me that I just described. It was also advanced by an American named John Boda. Mr. Boda contacted me and said, Andy, remember how you said that when they sent you to Ford Theater to see who shot President Lincoln, you went there 8 times and you only saw Lincoln twice? I said, yeah, I could never figure that out. And he said, well, Andy, I know why that happened. And I said, why, Mr. Boda? He said, because Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, came to Ford's Theater late that night and was serenaded by the cast and crew of Our American Cousin, starring Lord at Ford's Theater, and the playgoers there in the audience. So in other words, when they gave you the mission to pop into view there in front of Ford's Theater at 8 o'clock that night of April 15th, 1865, you were there on time, but the Lincolns were late. They were late to the theater. You can't meet somebody when they're late to an appointment by 15 to 30 minutes. It's not an appointment in Samara, as John O'Hara said. It's a missed appointment in Samara, right? You're not meeting them. And that's what I was reporting for years on the radio. So again, the internet allowed John Boda to connect important dots. What I had said about going to Ford's Theater was verified by something I didn't know. Nobody ever told me, hey, Andy, we figured out that the Lincolns came into the theater at like 8:30 that night. That's why when we sent you there at 8 o'clock or even 7:45, you only saw them 2 of 8 probes that we sent you on. They, of course, the ones where twice I saw myself in the lobby. That was a really dangerous mission because if I had touched myself, there would have been possibly a nuclear explosion.
Wow.
So I believe that that's pretty close to direct evidence. So hard to fake this obscure knowledge about Lincoln. I mean, I studied American history at UCLA, but I would challenge any of my history professors or same-age peers who were in the Bachelor of Arts U.S. History at UCLA in the 80s to know that the Lincoln came to the theater late on the night that President Lincoln was shot. Another proof that was physical evidence of my time travel is I took my friend Dixie's parents up to the old school site in Laney in 2004, and she parked the rental car on a hill up from the old school site, as it was called, in Laney, Lamy, New Mexico. And she said, Andy, why have you asked me to park the car here? And I said, well, Dixie, it's because here where I dropped a small little purple plastic hippopotamus from a Captain Crunch box in a mud puddle here, to go back and find and prove that I had been teleporting to New Mexico. Sometimes I believed I was dreaming it or something. So I wanted to leave physical evidence there. Are you following my logic, Aaron?
I'm following your logic. Yeah. You know,
okay.
that
so
might
in other words, if you leave a physical object somewhere,
right.
What does that prove as an exception to the rule against hearsay? That you really were there.
Yeah.
I mean, if you leave a note in a wall in Auschwitz saying, I was a Jewish inmate of the Nazi regime here from 1941 to my liberation in 1945 by American soldiers under the command of George S. Patton or something, that comes in to prove that you were an inmate at Auschwitz, right? Mm-hmm. So when I found that toy hippopotamus, that was an aha moment, but it was also a proof. I dropped it there. And I talked about it before I found it. So we walked to the front of her rental car, and we looked into the dirt, and there, in a dried mud puddle that looked like it had been getting wet and dry again for the intervening then 30 or so years, was that toy hippopotamus. That's what I call the purple hippo proof. You leave an object somewhere that you claim to be, that comes in to prove you were there. And that's what I did. Dixie is a witness to that, could testify.
Wow.
Then, during this whole period, 2003, 4, 8, during my 3 fact-finding trips, I remembered the time I've described in some interviews when the radiant energy in the teleporter at Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, was kind of running downward too quickly, like falling water in a public water sculpture, but too quickly. Mm-hmm. And nonetheless, my dad and I jumped through it. And when we did, we teleported past Santa Fe. And my dad then found a colleague of his named Cristobal Sanchez. I knew that his son, Edward, had talked to me outside near a tree because it was so hot in their house. They didn't have air conditioning. It was a hot day in Mexico. I found Ed Sanchez. He said, Andy, I remember you. I remember you said you had teleported there with your dad. You stated that you think you teleported into the streets of Santa Fe, not the state capitol grounds, because the radiant energy in the teleporter was the water you said was cascading too quickly. I can tell you that my father worked for the Los Alamos National Labs. I can confirm that your dad would have appeared at our house to call Dr. Agnew, the director of the labs. And here is a photograph of my father's retirement party. And this man right here is Dr. Harold M. Agnew. I'm sorry, but to those skeptics out there, those naysayers, those cliff eyes who say that I couldn't have time traveled because time travel didn't exist, but I say, unfortunately, I was time traveling with the brilliant physicist and inventor who brought us atomic bombs and then went on to discover time travel. I met with Ed Sanchez mentioned Dr. Harold M. Agnew. In other words, Harold is in the retirement picture of his father. His father worked with Agnew. I said we were going to Sanchez's home to call Dr. Agnew. About what? That we'd overshot the state council.
Wow.
So we're getting warm, Aaron, or would you say I'd prove Project Pegasus? I've got more, but what do you think at this stage in the analysis?
I think it's amazing. I think, if I was in the jury, I'd say, yeah, he's telling the truth. That's
Because
what
you're a man of truth and honor, of discretion. That's what we need as a great American civilization. We need to honor. We need to honor truth and the discretion to see the truth, not science fiction fantasy or mere assertion. Okay, another one. The writer Alexander Bruce worked on my second Fatima trilogy book, Celestial Secrets, The Hidden History of the Mystery of Fatima. Now, who is Alexander Bruce? He is a famous peer of mine, a couple of years younger or older, I'm not really sure, who is a writer of brilliant books. She holds a bachelor's degree in semi-honors, a difficult subject, from an Ivy League university, Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, where she was a personal friend and classmate of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., the only surviving son of our 35th president, President John F. Kennedy, who was expected to run for president and not died in that tragic plane crash in 1998. And Alexander Bruce told me, Andy, I believe you because I was shown a photograph by Carl Jack Pruitt, born 1934, who you say you worked with on Project Pegasus. And in that photograph, Jack Pruitt and his father were meeting with Nikola Tesla when Jack was like 35 years old. But wait a minute. Jack Pruitt turned 35 in 1969 when you say you entered Pegasus, and yet Tesla died in 1943 when Jack Pruitt could have been at the oldest 8 or 9 years old. So that proof operates on many levels. It confirms that people I identified as being asserting in Project Pegasus, Jack Pruitt was having contact with Nikola Tesla during Tesla's life, and that the age of that individual was the age that he would have had when I said I entered Pegasus. So it created both the Tesla-Pegasus connection, the Tesla-Pruitt family connection, and the Pruitt family connection, not only to Project Pegasus, but to 1959, because that's when Jack would have been 35. And that's about how he looked in the photo. Now, when Alexander Bruce said, I was shown that photograph of Jack and his dad meeting Tesla, and they had to be time traveled. Jack was too old, and his father's deceased. So, I was quite older in the photograph. Wouldn't be in his elder years in 1943 when Tesla died. And then Tesla died in 43. Others proves. If she said, I saw that photograph, that would be hearsay. But if that photograph was provided by either Alexander Bruce or Jack Pruitt, that would prove my claims. But I find it interesting that the same age peer who researched, for example, Dr. Robert Beckwith, namely Alexander Pruitt, made that Tesla-Pruitt family connection. Now, I interviewed Dr. Beckwith twice. Keith Bruce interviewed him once. And R. Ken Thomas of King Shovel Press interviewed Dr. Robert Beckwith once. That's 4 interviews. What did Bob Beckwith, a man that my father told me in the late 1980s, would be Mr. Cooper's character on Project Pegasus? That's what he did. He went on to publish an article about teleportation.
He published an article about teleportation.
Radio, right, when the radio broadcaster Greg Borstein stated recently that he found that article by Beckwith, I have to be true to the truth. I would go to where, but it does corroborate the claims by Basiago, Bird, and Thomas, or Ben Thomas, that in those interviews with Beckwith, the linkage between Beckwith, Pegasus, and teleportation was made. In other words, that article by Beckwith, as recently resourced by Ken Borson, or Greg Borson, comes in again as an ancient document, and that exception against reason. That's admissible evidence, and we have Greg Borson in that why that's admissible evidence. Now, okay, that is not hearsay.
Okay.
And
Your voice is sort of fading a little bit. Sometimes we have a hard time hearing portions of the words you're saying in the last couple paragraphs that you've talked. So if you could talk a little bit closer to the microphone or the phone or something so we can hear
to be
you.
honest, I have a cell phone. I have switched to turn it down just to hold it in the way that I put my fingers in the way of the speaker. I sometimes push that button down. So I apologize to our listeners.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, what was the proof that Governor Jesse Ventura accomplished? He got direct evidence that a woman who was living in the house that I said my father and I had lived in 1973 and then 1972 knew who Dr. Harold Agnew was, that he was the director of LANO in the 70s, and that she had heard of Project Pegasus. That was, what do you think, direct evidence or hearsay evidence?
Direct?
That was direct evidence of my claims of living there.
Yeah. Under
the time period when Agnew was the director of Los Alamos National Labs. I mean, if you're in New York City when John Lindsay is mayor, and you say, well, I know I was in New York City when I teleported there because here's a picture of me and Mayor Lindsay, that comes in. So when Governor Ventura obtained that testimony from that woman who was living in that house, that was direct evidence to prove my claims about the linkage between Harold M. Agnew, the Los Alamos Labs, and Project Pegasus. Okay, the Art Bell proof. Art Bell confirmed that when I did his show on August 14th, 2015, that in October 1971, he and I had contact when I was a child of about 10, and he was a 25-year-old technician working at ITT Defense Communication in Nutley, New Jersey. An old friend of mine stated in distributing my recent interview with Dr. Sala far and wide on the internet that Dr. Sala confirmed that after hearing that interview with Art Bell, he found my claims plausible. Well, that represents the sort of parsimonious confirmation of my truth that has been shared by others. Dr. Sala didn't say that he found my claims plausible after that interview with Art Bell, when Art confirmed that I was in a classified defense-related facility. That, in fact, was what convinced Dr. Sala that I was telling the truth. And plausibility isn't confirmation of somebody's truth-telling. It's just that what they're saying might be true. Mm-hmm. So that kind of is a measure of the parsimonious treatment I've gotten for true claims. People are saying things like, well, this was the interview that caused Dr. Sala to believe that Andy's claims are plausible. Not true. Au contraire, as they say in France. That interview with Art Bell convinced the political science PhD, Dr. Sala, that I was telling the truth. And that's true history. So that is the Art Bell proof as received by Dr. Sala.
Awesome.
As direct evidence.
Awesome.
And then we'll see what else I have. Oh, there was the Mark proof. My fellow teleporting Mark came forward on those two shows. That was direct evidence. When he came on Dave Schrader's show
that's
on
true.
radio, and then listened to Sharif Gio's Truth Frequency Radio show.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Aaron? Do you think that was direct evidence?
I think it was direct evidence.
Bingo. Yes. You betcha, as we say in the law. Washington State, Oregon.
You betcha.
Mark came forward, and since he did come forward, I can share his surname. It was Mark DePrimo. We used to call him Hippo when he ran for my eldest brother for president of Mount View Road School in the 70s, or late 60s, actually. Like 68, 69. And Mark DePrimo came forward and said, I teleported from New Jersey to New Mexico with Andy. That is direct evidence. That is a witness participant saying, I did this with this claimant.
Yeah.
Because after all, direct evidence is what you did, what you saw directly, or what you filmed or photographed while under the impress of that event. They all come in as direct evidence. So Mark DePrimo has presented direct evidence on the record, on live radio shows, of teleporting to New Mexico with me. Anybody who alleges that I'm lying has to, by extension, believe that Mark DePrimo is lying. And why would a lawyer in Washington State and a musician on the East Coast make up some cockamamie story about teleporting between New Jersey and New Mexico and back? What would be our gain? That's an individual who hasn't been in contact with my family for 50 years, okay, that I found based on decades of scouring the historical record, which is the nature of all these proofs I'm presenting tonight. Okay. Now, when I was in Santa Fe in summer of 1972, I would not officially cross the state of New Mexico until November of 1972, which any of my surviving 4 older siblings could confirm if they were interviewed. They'd be admissible. I'm sure I could get one of them to testify at a trial of this matter. Did Andy tell the truth about Project Pegasus and time travel, time traveling in it? And yet, I have uncovered an individual who met me in Santa Fe in 1972. Well, wait a minute. If I was in Santa Fe in summer of 1972, and my 4 older siblings would say, well, we didn't go into New Mexico by plane, train, or automobile until November of 1972. I remember even going to Carlsbad Cavern, White Sands with our family. How could it be that my beloved, my fiancée, Shelley Gwen Coleman, met me in Santa Fe in 1972?
Wow.
How could it be that I remember that as she walked past my father and I, and her girlfriend, who's now identified as Laura Schupbach, said, are you doing okay dealing with this heat here in New Mexico? Because she was visiting from somewhere else in the country. And she said, yes, as long as I'm wearing my halter or halter top, I'm fine. And I walked by, and as a somewhat younger gentleman, said to the beautiful blonde, why do they call it a halter? And having the gift of humor and discretion, my beloved turned 50 years ago, Eric, 50 years ago, and said to me, that's for me to know and for you to find out.
Wow. Wow.
And I am engaged to be married to that wonderful woman. Okay. So how is it that after being one of America's early chrononauts, one of its early time-space explorers, the love of my life, the only woman I've ever proposed marriage to, the person I am engaged to and will marry when we see fit, met me in Santa Fe before I was ever there by a conventional means. So there must be, just as with the Josephine Cobb image, surviving those 95% of Civil War photographs that were destroyed after the war, but yet depicted me taking plasma confinement to Gettysburg in 1863. When I think of Gwen's meeting with me in 1972 in Santa Fe, I must be honest, those listening, and share the fact that I see the hand of the Almighty in our lives. And I think the Almighty wanted this information to come forward. Why would there be so many fractals, so much confirmation of what happened, that I would literally go on to marry the individual, and she marry me, who met when I had to get there via teleportation? Because we crossed New Mexico as a family via a 1968 maroon Chevy Impala station wagon in November 1972. How is it that Gwen met me there in summer?
In November 72,
Now,
instead of summer.
because she flew there, but I didn't. That's not true history. It's because I teleported there. And that is, I believe, direct evidence. It's at least collateral direct evidence of the fact that I teleported there.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of my symptoms, when we crossed New Mexico, my dad turned to my mom and said, "Honey, where should we stop for breakfast?" I leaned forward in the station wagon and said to my dad, I think I was sitting in the back seat, although we shot that between my parents, but I was still across the country in November of 72. I said, "Dad, why don't we go up to Albuquerque and go to either the La Hacienda or the La Placida? Maybe Connie will be there."
Ooh.
And one of my sisters turned to me and said, "Andy, when were you in Albuquerque with Dad? And what are the La Hacienda and the La Placida? Who is Connie?" And I said, "I was in Albuquerque with Dad in Project Pegasus after teleporting there. The La Hacienda and the La Placida are restaurants where we ate, and his old friend Connie Chavez works there. She was often with us in New Mexico." So anyway, those are all direct proof. Now, I don't want to bother my siblings with these proofs because it's not their desire to be public figures. They've got their private lives. I've got a public life.
Right.
We have to respect people's boundaries, their privacy, their life plan.
Well,
but I have a fiance who's available to testify about meeting me when I was in Santa Fe in 1972, 15 years ago this year, Aaron.
Wow.
And that is my now substantial concatenation of direct proofs of my direct involvement in time travel technology in DARPA's Project Pegasus circa 1967-68 to 1972. So, do you have any questions?
Do I have any questions? I think this is fantastic. If you
ask, are you invited to our wedding? The answer is yes.
Oh,
I want you to be one of my ushers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm very good at holding a flashlight, so I'll be a good usher.
Yeah.
I do have a question. It's about if you can remember, I know it was a long time ago, but when you were plasma confinement, when you were doing that, was there a particular smell when you were wormholing? Was there like an odor? The plasma, did it have a smell to it?
Well, the wormholing in the particular tunnel that the plasma confinement chamber under Dr. Sterling Colgate, and my father, was used to send me from East Hanover, New Jersey in 1972 to the area north of Gettysburg. So I had to walk into town from the farmlands north of Gettysburg, where now Gettysburg College is. There wasn't a smell in the tunnel, but as I was sort of spit out in 1863, there was a very strong odor of ozone.
Oh.
And I was being irradiated. I think I described in a previous installment of The Quest for Truth that my father, during those 3 years of childhood, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, which for me was like fall of 69 to spring of 72, was taking me down into our cellar in New Jersey and giving me shots of vanadium in my left calf muscle.
Wow.
Well, I said, "Dad, why are you giving me these shots? What are they?" He said, "Vanadium." And I said, "Why are you giving me shots of this thing called vanadium?" I don't remember whether that's element 19 or 23. I think it's element 20. 3. I've never been an expert on the periodic table of the element. But it's one of those two, because I knew it was in my dad's birth year, 1923. He said, son, I'm giving you the shots of vanadium to protect your teeth and bones from radiation. So yes, as I described on last week's installment of The Quest for Truth, I was an experimentee. They were testing the response of we children to those technologies, like plasma confinement. Did this child develop cancer? Did this child die teleporting? Did this child freak out and go crazy being sent back to the past or future, by, for example, by a chronovisor or looking glass? Right. So yes, I would smell a really strong smell of ozone right when the plasma confinement chamber would spit us out in the past. For a temporary probe or placement in the past.
Interesting. I just looked up vanadium, and it says vanadium is a chemical. Here, I'll post it in the chat here.
Well, it used to be believed as a cure for diabetes, by the way, too. That's maybe a lot of diabetes. Not so much just from metformin destroying our kidneys, but not so much just diabetes from the device that was used to teleport us in Pegasus, but from radiation, like the plasma confinement chamber.
It says just on the intranet, vanadium is a chemical element with the symbol V and the atomic number 23. It is a hard silvery gray, malleable transition metal. The elemental metal is rarely found in nature, but once isolated artificially, the formation of an oxide layer, passivation, somewhat stabilizes the free metal against further oxidation. So that's
right. And so that's interesting, I think, on the level of minerals, in the sense that it seems like another metal, and it seems like a transitional metal, it's like thing. Bismuth is still on page 83. And my dad mentioned the connection between bismuth and chronovisor. They were putting an EM signal through the inside bismuth crystal.
An EM signal through the 8-sided bismuth crystal.
Create the hologram.
Okay, right.
Was the time-space hologram that we initially were using to visit the past, and then on that November 5th, 1971 probe to the future, for which I accidentally met Art Bell at ITG Defense in sort of mid-October of 1971, was the first probe to push chronovisor into the future.
Wow.
Maybe I was injured by that, but that, I think I've earned my props time traveling, and I'm not wishing to play the role of judge or jury to those who are claimants in this literature.
Right.
After all, I confirmed Relk and Neumann, and then I brought forward 4 fellow astronauts and the member of a presidential family regarding Mars. It was my goal all along to bring these people forward. And look at the people I brought forward tonight. These are only some of the direct participants, living and dead, who were in Project Pegasus.
Wow.
If I can find Kevin, the boy who lost his feet, I will publish his name and date of birth to show that I was remembering the past accurately. He said, my feet, I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without HG&P? Mm-hmm. So cool. Kevin, if you're out there, you remember Andy, who lived up the street from you? Andy Basiago, there on Countrywood Drive? Give me a call. Look me up at the Washington State Bar Association.org website. I've got major information for you, Kevin, that will clarify why you've been living on prosthetic feet now for 15 years, 52 years since that grievous, tragic accident that I witnessed you experienced.
Terrible.
Kevin, you are one of America's early time-space explorers, like I, but I was luckier because my physical damage occurred decades later. Yours was immediate. And just like the brave Americans lost aboard the Challenger and the Columbia space shuttles, you deserve to be recognized for your sacrifice to the defense efforts of this great country. The survival and the success of liberty, that's what we were supposed to be about. As President Kennedy said, the survival and the success of liberty. And that's what I've been speaking in.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Wow.
So that's basically tonight, Aaron. I mean, those are the proofs. There are others. Those are just some proofs of Project Pegasus, both hearsay and direct evidence, that I just worked on over the last week, just sitting down at my kitchen table and just remembering these proofs. There's others.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew D. Basiago is an amazing truth hero and an amazing memory anomaly. We're really lucky to have him to come forward with all this top secret information. And when we do have a show in the future, when we have questions, call-in questions, I want to make a plea to everyone. Ask about Andy's experiences and the people he was dealing with in the programs. There's plenty of material there, because that's...
an interesting character in that regard, Aaron, is Courtney Maurice Hunt.
Okay.
Anybody could probably now do a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, and find possibly a lot of deleted documents, but proof that Courtney M. Hunt was a CIA agent. I have linked him to specific memories of interacting with him on Project Pegasus and Project Mars. In fact, he would frequently go to the Red Planet with Blaine Stillings. He was the individual who was operating the aeronautical repositioning chamber when I first went on July 7th, 1981. And I said, "Come on, Cord, light this candle," paraphrasing the American astronaut Alan Bartlett Shepard from 1961. He was my birth. And Courtney laughed ruefully, like only a cigarette-smoking man CIA can laugh ruefully. With that scratchy voice.
Yeah.
And Courtney was also a fiction writer, like his first cousin, E. Howard Hunt, of JFK assassination and Watergate fame.
Oh, they were related.
Involved in time travel and going to Mars. So there's got to be something in there to be found under Courtney M. Hunt. Even his children could probably be found, like Thomas Hunt of Texas, and asked, "Was your dad in the CIA? Is Andy Basiago telling the truth about Courtney Maurice Hunt?" And I'm sure some member of the Hunt family will say, yes, he was.
Company man.
When an investigator asked his ex-wife, Linda Hunt, of Providence, Rhode Island, "Did Courtney M. Hunt, your former husband, work for the CIA?" She said, "No, he was just a gas station mechanic for Exxon." That was his cover job, and all people working for the intel community are not only shadow listed with a branch of the military, not only do they have officer status with some branch of the U.S. military, but they have day jobs. So I had a day job as a reporter for the UCLA Daily Bruin, and I had the naval credentials and photograph of myself with an alias, and then my true name was listed at the Naval Investigative Service in Upland, California, when I was going to Mars. Same as probably to be found with Courtney M. Hunt. There might even be some records at Exxon Corporation that he was receiving specialized checks from Exxon to pay some of his CIA salary. So I've been talking about real people, real Americans. They were brave men and women who were serving in these programs primarily to protect the American people. In the case of Project Pegasus, it was to protect us from the destruction that a thermonuclear war would bring. It would bring the end, the eclipsing of civilization itself. In the case of Project Mars, it was to put an American presence on Mars to deal with the extraterrestrial presence on our moon. That's why the claimants who are claiming they were on the moon after 1972, when we were chased off the moon, I simply relegate to the realm of science fiction fantasy, of made-up claims of service in the SSP. But those are the two reasons why people served in Project Pegasus and Project Mars. It wasn't to implement, as Weber has suggested, a chronic archy to oppress us by manipulating quantum engineering and led to the ability to know what the future held. Because look, when you go to the past and you go to the future, you're there. So how can you change the past or future by going to it?
Yeah.
Okay. So the whole idea that a chronography developed from the ashes of Project Pegasus is another, I believe, science fiction fantasy. I salute Dr. Weber, or I might call him as a fellow JD, for doing significant thinking of ways in which time travel could have been exploited by the deep state, the permanent secret government, shadow government, if you will, based on having early knowledge or prior knowledge of the future. But to my knowledge, the only thing they were doing was briefing future presidents and vice presidents of their destiny as such. And I talked about meeting the Bushes, George H.W. and George W., Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama decades before they were president, being told about the presidencies of Trump and Biden, and meeting Vice President Richard B. Cheney when I was on the project. I was only about 29 years old. So I can be amenable to asking questions about how the time travel technologies that were developed in Project Pegasus were exploited by the deep state, by the permanent secret government. But I have no evidence beyond that. They knew about certain things like the advent of the internet, the cell phone revolution, the emergence of AIDS as a communicable, lethal pandemic.
9/11. 9/11.
9/11.
That one gets
the
me.
Internet.
That one gets me because they knew since 71 or 72 when you were shown that footage, that looped footage of a plane hitting one of the twin towers that wasn't even only halfway built yet, and they knew when it was going to happen. They didn't evacuate. That's
right, Aaron. And but again, you can't make a judgment until all the information. I'm not defending what was done or not done.
Yeah.
But we don't know why they didn't try to stop 9/11 and all of its grievous harm to our fellow citizens and indeed world citizens. Like nationals of like 90 countries were killed in the strikes on the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
In Manhattan.
It was terrible.
On September 11th of 2001. What I know is that they made a capital decision not to try to change the future based on perceiving it, because the whole thing would damage the quality of the information they were getting through time travel, and that might endanger the country even more profoundly. So I'm not defending their decision about not trying to prevent 9/11. I think it's quite possible that FBI agent John O'Neill took up residence in the Twin Towers to prevent that event. But I don't have all the information, so I would urge everybody to withhold judgment until we do get all this information. If my truth campaign about time travel is successful, we will get a statement about why the government concealed their knowledge of 9/11, maybe sharing it with just some corporations that evacuated their employees from the Twin Towers and urged them not to come in that day. In the same way that by writing a letter to President Obama after he left office, I got him to change his position and admit the existence of the secret space program. And I would submit that event and to contextualize what I have not just offered but achieved within the emerging literature of the secret space program. So we don't know why they didn't act to prevent 9/11. So just like we don't know, I mean, remember the film Rashomon by the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa?
No.
Different people see an event in the woods at different times, and one person thinks it was a rape, one people thinks it was a murder, one person thinks it was an abduction, one person thought somebody was attacking somebody, but the other perceived they were defending themselves. In other words, we all see reality through the lens, through the position and time space of only semi-overlapping reality. So as regards 9/11, we don't have the full data to know why there was a decision not to prevent 9/11 or warn people to get out of that building.
Right. Yeah.
We do know that the 3,000 or 4,000 people of 90 nations who did die were a very small percentage of everything should have been in those buildings that day. So it looks like there wasn't effort to evacuate those buildings. It was just marginally unsuccessful.
Wow.
It was like 5% for those who would have been in those buildings.
Wow. Yeah.
Boy. That would be my analysis based on what I know. But, I left government service in 1984. Mm-hmm. I graduated from UCLA, and my last trip to Mars via ARC was in August of 1984. I graduated from UCLA on June 15th of 84. So I don't know the answer to 9/11, which occurred, 17 years after I left government service?
Yeah.
Which happened 11 years after my dad urged me to tell the story of Pegasus, 12 years after my late father urged me to tell the story of DARPA's Project Pegasus.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I do know that they did make such a decision based on information that has not been shared with us. Mm-hmm. If somebody was actually rescuing somebody from an attacker and they looked like they were attacking that person, would it be right for any of us to testify and say, I saw A attacking B? When A has already said, no, I was rescuing B from attack when that person saw me in the woods. That's basically the thrust of the Rashomon effect. We all see reality through different lenses, and it's a profound evidential issue. That's what American courts of the federal, state, and local level try to resolve by setting up, for example, these rather brilliant rules to discern hearsay from direct evidence. I've tried to do that tonight.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's what we have to do.
Yes, and thanks for helping clarify that. I've been really curious about hearsay evidence because my nephew was his life was threatened. His ex-girlfriend told him she was going to have him killed and she was going to laugh. She told him that twice. He went to the police twice with information. And then 2 weeks later, when he was shot 20 times and killed, that was not admissible into evidence, those police reports, because they were considered hearsay.
Well, that's tragic, and I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah.
You have my condolences that happened. Excuse me.
Yeah, he was 18.
But that really goes to the kind of the theme or sub-theme of tonight's broadcast. Hearsay evidence is not necessarily untrue. That's another fallacy.
Right.
It's just not considered admissible because it's not reliable, because it's not direct or actual evidence. It is actual evidence, but it's not in a scientific sense, or it can be, but it's not actual evidence in a legal sense. So it's barred from coming in to prove the truth of the matter asserted. But if a policeman came in and said, I heard her say that she was going to shoot her boyfriend, you're saying that's what didn't come in because it wasn't your nephew?
It was my nephew, my only nephew, yeah. And
it wasn't your nephew saying she's going to kill me. Like a film of your nephew saying, look, she has threatened to take my life. That would have come in. Because it would have been a direct statement by him.
It was.
Which he had threatened.
I believe he filed a police report, 2 police reports, because she threatened him twice. And he was sleeping in a
different. That should have come in.
He was sleeping.
That should have come in.
He was sleeping in a different area.
Yeah, that should have come in under the mimic rule. What is that? Motive, intent, absence of mistake, identity, common scheme, or plan.
Uh-huh.
That should have come in under the mimic rule to at least prove that she intended to take his life.
Yeah.
And I'm really sorry that that's justice. She should have been convicted.
She was never even charged. But the gunman, the cousin of her current boyfriend, was the gunman, a 16-year-old. He's out of prison already.
Well, he also was saying, or gave testimony that she intended to shoot him. That was common scheme or plan. She said who it was. That was identity. He he did get shot by her. That was intent. So there were a couple grounds there for that to come in. Pretty much not to prove that she took his life on a given day, but that she was in the realm. She was in the group of potential assailants.
She threatened him,
and therefore deserved to be.
She threatened him. She threatened him twice.
She wasn't even tried. That was a miscarriage.
She said, I'm gonna have. Yeah, she said, I'm gonna have you. I'm gonna have you killed, and I'm gonna laugh. That's what she said. And my nephew was so afraid. He said, this summer is going to be one big fight. And he was sleeping in a different area on the floor of his bedroom because he thought he was going to get shot through his window. And he was shot on the first day of summer. His 18th.
So he took efforts to protect himself. Well, that's terrible. I'm so sorry that happened.
Yeah, so I've not been a fan of hearsay evidence laws since then. The
issue is reliability, and the statement that she said something wasn't the victim's statement recorded.
Right.
Like, past recollection recorded, she is planning to take my life. And he was deceased, and that caused the problem. But also, it would have been hearsay even if somebody had heard her say it. Now, if somebody had witnessed the crime and was available to testify, that would have come in as direct evidence. That kind of goes to the old saw in the law, that there are no deaf mutes in prison. There are these restrictions, and I wasn't really attempting to laud or showcase American law or legal procedure because I've got problems with it too.
Right.
I'm not even practicing law anymore. But just to show that just because something is hearsay, as in the case you cited, doesn't mean it's not true.
Right. But it might not.
Hearsay evidence I present about Project Pegasus and my service in it. Yes, it is. The things I shared tonight that's hearsay were hearsay, but they were also true.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah.
And you notice how in many of these instances of hearsay evidence, there was collateral corroboration. There were things attached to those statements, those pictures or whatever, that did suggest that they were true. The problem is directness and lack of directness affecting reliability, and a lack of reliability affecting admissibility as a matter of legal procedure. Mm-hmm. And that system we're living in.
Well,
sometimes lead to tragic outcomes.
Yes.
But the goal in general is to prevent innocent people from being found guilty of a crime or liable for tort, etc. Just based on what somebody has said about it.
Right. Well, like if someone made a statement or went to the police and said, hey, this guy said he's going to push me in front of a train, and then one day he just goes and jumps in front of a train to try and entrap that guy who didn't do it. So
entrapment or somebody says she said she was going to shoot him. Well, sir, did you see her shoot him? Did you see her even buying a gun and saying I'm going to use this to kill this individual? So what you end up is essentially trying the truth of the matter asserted and finding it lacking because it's not what happened per se. It was witnessed, but what somebody said happened. So essentially, we're trying to prevent people from being convicted or being liable in the civil law for what is asserted because people lie, because people don't see things clearly, because something else happened. Like somebody could buy a gun to shoot somebody and then somebody else could shoot them. So I'm sorry that happened, but that's the way the law operates, and that's what I'm trying to distinguish tonight regarding my time travel claims.
Well, thank you, Andy. You're such a wealth of knowledge in so many different areas, and I have to mention there's someone in our chat, Mary Magdalene Mendoza, and she has some broken bones and she's in some pain. So if we could all keep her in your prayers, Mary Magdalene Mendoza.
Well, Mary, we will keep you in our prayers. I'm so sorry that happened to you. I think if we all begin and continue to pray for the good, that we're going to make it. And we have a tough battle ahead of us because of those who would wish to oppose the forces of good. Maybe that could be the focus of a later broadcast of the Quest for Truth.
Yes. Well, thank you, Andy. This has been fantastic. Is there anything that you want to say? Oh, and I also have to thank you so much for mentioning my name and the show you do on my channel when you were interviewed by Dr. Michael Sala. Thank you very much. That's really
You got it, Aaron. I mean, we're all part of history. We're all direct participants in history. There are some who are sitting on the bank, and then there are some who are braving the waters of the river. And, you know, as President Theodore Roosevelt said, that's leadership. That's knowing the sweat of the arena on your brow. And I salute you for joining that river of history. And we all need to recognize, as I stated at the outset of tonight's broadcast, that simply evaluating what some are asserting is true history and finding it wanting for a variety of reasons is not attacking them. It's simply analyzing what's being asserted and try to frame true history. That's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that turkey who ran into Olympic Stadium in Munich in 1972 by simply putting some running clothes on and slapping a phony number to his chest did not win the Olympic marathon. Frank Shorter of the United States did, who had won the silver, in Mexico City in 68. And who was his Yale professor who was doing color commentaries for the ABC Wild World of Sports on that day? The great novelist Aaron Siegel, the man who wrote Love Story, which was made into that film by, what was it, Ryan O'Neal and Alan McGraw, I think. But anyway, Professor Siegel was watching his student, Frank Shorter, finish the Olympic marathon, a race of 26 miles through the streets of Munich, Germany, which could not have been easy. I mean, I try to get exercise, and I feel tired and have to lay down.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And running has never been my sport, okay?
Me either.
And Eric Siegel was saying, he's an imposter, Frank. He's an imposter. That man who ran in the Olympic Stadium is an imposter. He did not run the marathon. He is not finishing ahead of you. Keep on running, Frank. You've won the marathon.
Wow.
Now, I asked those who thought I was attacking Tony Rodriguez. Was Eric Siegel attacking that imposter who was faking the fact that he had finished the Olympic marathon?
No.
After winning it, after running it?
No.
No. He was defending true history. He was defending the fact that Frank Shorter of the United States ran that race and was winning it. And that's what I've been trying to do regarding the literature of the secret space program. I've been trying to weed out the imposters, and that is not an attack on such people. It is not a matter of being egotistical or some other disparagement that somebody could offer. It's simply somebody who was involved trying to evaluate those who are making such claims to determine true history. And that's been my only goal. As I said, I brought forward, what has it been? 4 fellow astronauts, a member of a presidential family, and confirmed 2 other participants in the secret space program. Aaron, it was my goal to knock other people out of the water and refute their claims. Why would I have done that at the outset of this heroic effort by all of us? I mean, confirming 6 fellow astronauts and a member of a presidential family, 7 people, 8 total, including myself. Why would I then just go on some lark, some jag, and start pointing out that some of the later stories have been almost certainly made up? Why would I do that? I wanted to bring people forward, and I did. Why would I then start essentially engaged in a pattern of tearing down the truth movement or the emerging literature of the secret space program? By doing so, I've only been forced to do so because some of the people in that second group of 8 to 10 claimants are lying, and I've shown that they've been lying. And I provided their names and described why I know they've been lying.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, like I said, it's just bearing witness to history. It's not attacking somebody. An attack is a wanton treatment of somebody that they don't deserve. When somebody makes an assertion and they're knocked down by truth, they're just getting their just desserts. They're not being attacked by that person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if 12 members of a jury of our peers say, yes, you know, that person robbed that bank, Joe Bloggs robbed that bank. Well, Joe Bloggs isn't being attacked by the judge or jury. He's being convicted by a jury of his peers. So, sadly, a number of that second group of 8 to 10 claimants in the literature of the secret space program have been convicted and found wanting, have been found to be lying by essentially a jury of their peers. Ralph, Neumann, Basiago, Stillett, Mendez, Whitecrow, Johnston, Eisenhower. Okay, that's 8 people. And it's not me. It's not Andy on some jag, some tear trying to tear down the truth movement. I've been leading the truth movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I've earned my props, and everybody has to stay with me in analyzing these claims. When Johann Fritz, whose real name is Will Nutter, could not identify the thesis that he wrote for either of the 2 PhDs he claimed, that was a serious threat to the validity of his statement.
Mm-hmm.
Just as if somebody said, I wasn't in the bank when it was robbed. I didn't rob the bank, and I don't own a blue turtleneck sweater. And a photo was offered of them in the bank with a gun in a blue turtleneck sweater. That's the way evidence works. So unfortunately, some of these claimants have been convicted of lying. And that is not an attack by me. That's the result of a sound evidential analysis.
Right. Now, in the case of the PhD, I had a friend who claimed they had a PhD and then pointed to his license plate that had PhD and then 3 numbers. So maybe that's what kind of PhD he had on his license
Maybe
plate.
that meant pilot hiring deeper, as has been suggested for many doctoral level degrees in philosophy.
Hiring deeper.
But, you know, I mean,
It's funny.
I don't know why Will Nutter took the name Johann Fritz. And I don't know why he asserted he had 2 PhDs. Could it be because a chief proponent of time travel in the literature of the secret space program, Alfred Weber, had 2 degrees from Yale? Could it be because I have 2 master's degrees, one from Cambridge? I think maybe. That's why he asserted he had 2 PhDs to sound like an academically educated individual and hence more credible, despite the fact that he's making up this claim. I think so. I can't prove it, but I can cogitate on the matter and frame such a corroborative argument for what's going on. I'm even wondering why all these people are always changing their name. I'm using the name, Aaron, that I was given at birth.
Me too.
In September of 1961. Why are these people always changing their name? I mean, I have a name, a surname, Basiago, that's very rare and very difficult to pronounce and to spell. It's a Polish surname. Only people from my family who have been married to people in my family have ever used in America. In Poland, it doesn't even end with the letter O. It ends with the letter A, right? So why, if I never changed my name, why are these individuals always changing their name? Isn't it prima facie evidence of deception that you use an alias? Isn't that a known fact that somebody trying to pull the wool over other people's eyes often uses an alias? Why are there so many people in so-called truth movement who are doing so?
Well, they're doing so so they can't be targeted as easily because they're going after these people because they're spilling the truth and they've.
Well, that may be true, but see, again, when you change your name, you attack the substrates of truth in your claims. You whittle away at the foundation of the truth of what you're saying, because you're not saying I, Joe Bloggs, did so and so or saw so.
Right.
You're saying I, Joe Bloggs, but Joe Bloggs isn't my name, did so and so or saw so. You see, and that attack the truth value of somebody shares. So they may have all the reasonable motives in the world for using aliases, but I'm just saying it goes to the truth of people's allegations.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't allow them to rise above the level not only of mere allegation under the law, but concealment of truth or false statements based on using an assumed name.
Right. Yes. Good point. Good point. Well,
Okay, so let's put that. Well, okay, Will Nutter. Why did you select the name Johann Fritz? When you did select the name Johann Fritz, which is obviously German in derivation, did you know about the claim that there was a German presence on the red planet? Who told you that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, why did you select the name Johann Fritz rather than Joe Franklin or Bill Harris or some American name, an Anglo-Saxon name from this country? Was it because there was that claim about a German presence on Mars and you were trying to falsely allege that you were in the secret space program by claiming that you were a German when your real name is William Nutter, not a German name?
Right.
So these are the kind of questions that have to be asked of these people, Aaron, and they're not.
Well,
and I'm not being hard on them.
If my name was Nutter, Andy, if my name was Nutter, I think I might change it to, I don't know, Nutter. But thank you.
Nutter butter?
Nutter butter, peanut butter sandwich cookie. Yeah. Well, Andy, it's been awesome talking to you again and being the moderator of this awesome show that you have here on my channel, and looking forward to our next show. And we're going to try and do one around the 7th of every month, and extra shows like these two we've done a week apart from each other. Anytime you want, Andy. So if there's something you want to bring to the public.
Well, yeah, I'm going to be doing Dr. Sala's show, as I stated.
Awesome.
His broadcast on YouTube on the 28th of every month. I would urge our listeners to visit that. I'm going to try to also do several episodes of The Quest for Truth in between those. I'll do it as much as my health allows and my ideas exist. I do have a lot more information to share. And remember, I called it The Quest for Truth to announce the fact, to certainly give my understanding to our great listeners. The truth is not an end state. It's a beginning. It's a quest for the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what we have now regarding the last two American presidents, Donald John Trump and Joseph Robinette Biden. We have all kinds of charges and countercharges being made. The truth regarding both presidents, Trump and Biden, is emerging. It is disputed. It is a matter of partisan speculation and partisan allegation. It has not yet emerged. So let's remember that the truth movement is not an end state, it's a destination. And it's a destination that we only seldom reach.
Oh, good point. Good point.
So that's why we inaugurated the Quest for Truth.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Andy. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron, and good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody. And good night, chat. Thank you very much.